Welcome, everyone, to the Intrusible Chamber. Before introducing my guest for this evening, I want to start by reading an introduction to Litento Cele Bulla Unionis Graecorum, the Rejoice in the Heavens, there is union between the Catholic and the Greek churches. Let the heavens be glad, and let the earth rejoice, for the wall that divided the Western and the Eastern church has been removed. Peace and harmony have returned since the cornerstone, Christ, who made both one, has joined both sides with a very strong bond of love and peace, uniting and holding them together in a covenant of everlasting unity. After a long haze of grief and a dark and unlovely gloom of long enduring strife, the radiance of hoped-for union has illuminated all. This in 1439 during the Council of Florence. However, one Greek historian of the 15th century, Michael Doukas, commented as he saw the Greek contingent from the council returning to Constantinople. As the metropolitans disembarked from the ships, the citizens greeted them as was customary, asking, "What of our business? What of the council? Did we prevail?" And they answered, "We have sold our faith. We have exchanged true piety for impiety. We have betrayed the pure sacrifice and become upholders of unleavened bread." So the question is, how did we get here? And what went so wrong for the stream? Because I'm not sure many people listening will have even heard of the union of the churches, the brief union of the churches between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, which technically existed between 1439 and 1484. But there's also a more disturbing thought that's just entered my head, which is, what if people have no idea what we're talking about at all, and people haven't even heard of the Great Schism? So I think, first of all, I would like to say hello, Mr. Patriarch. We haven't had you on this channel for quite some time, but I think first I would like to have you introduce yourself again, and also perhaps to tell us a little bit about what the Great Schism is.
Absolutely. Happy to be back. Yes, my name is Mr. Patriarch. I run a YouTube channel occasionally. I used to make more regular content, about 2 pieces a week for some time, but since moving back from South Africa and, making more children and starting a new business and stuff and getting back into music, it's just, I don't know, just the drive or the time isn't quite there anymore. But I promise I will finish the Reflections of a Russian Statesman series. So that is my very long ongoing project on my channel. So as the token Orthodox guy on the this here stream, I will first make a disclaimer. I am not an Orthodox expert, Orthodox theologian, or any kind of learned scholar on these matters. I am merely a
Don't oversell yourself.
I'm merely a convert and family man. I do attend a very good parish. I initially got interested in Orthodoxy around 2015. And so I guess you could say I started getting into it before it really became super cool online. And then, but as anyone knows, when you're changing religions, it's a long and arduous process, internally, spiritually, and typically not something that happens right away. So I was baptized in Cape Town, South Africa in 2022, where I lived at the time, and have been attending services since. I have 3 children baptized in the church, and my wife is well on her way, we might say. So those are my bona fides. Now, specifically about the Great Schism, from the Orthodox perspective, it was in response to what is known as the filioque controversy as one major point. So for those who are unaware, the filioque is an addition to the Nicene Constantinople Creed, where in the, original Orthodox saying, it's, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And sorry, I usually start it from the beginning. Going from the middle is a little difficult.
Yes, I was wondering if you're going to do the whole thing.
Yeah, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten of the Father, begotten of the Father before all worlds, light of light, true God of true God, begotten not made, of one essence with the Father, by whom all things were created, and in the Holy Spirit, which proceeds from the Father. In the addition, it says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And according to the Orthodox position, this sort of puts the Holy Spirit as sort of a subordinate character to the two hypostases, to use a Greek term, of the Trinity. So in the Trinity, you have God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And in Orthodox theology, we have this notion of the monarchia of the Father, which is that God the Father eternally generates the Son and the Holy Spirit from himself. So all three aspects of the Godhead share the same divine essence, but they are at the same time, although they share the same divine essence, their personhood is somewhat distinct. So they all share the same traits, but the only difference, I guess, between the three is sort of how they typically interact with the created world, and also the fact that the Son and the Holy Spirit are generated perpetually and for all time from God the Father. So they share the same divine essence, and in this way, we can say Jesus Christ is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but we would not say that they're exactly the same thing. So they are God. They're one simple essence. They are undivided. They are totally in union, but God the Father spirates the Son and the Holy Trinity from himself. Now, with the filioque, with the language that the Spirit is sent by the Son, this causes problems in, Christology, or it can potentially cause problems in Christology, and also subordinates the Holy Spirit to the Son, which the Orthodox would have take issue with. And additionally, at the time of the Great Schism, the papacy was making certain claims of authority over the Eastern churches that hitherto had not existed. So it is true that the Bishop of Rome has always had a seat of honor, a seat of prominence and respect within the Orthodox churches, in a very similar way that the Patriarch of Constantinople does, for example, because Rome was where Peter was ended his ministry, and where he passed away and was martyred, and also because Rome at the time was the seat of the empire, which would become Christianized under Constantine. For these reasons, Rome and the bishop there had a certain degree of prestige and authority, and it functioned as an appellate jurisdiction. So, for example, if you were a bishop in Asia Minor and you were having an issue with another bishop, you would typically go up to your patriarch to arbitrate the dispute, but you could use Rome as an appeals court, if you will. So you could have a third party, namely Rome, hear your case and act as sort of an arbitrator. So the from the Orthodox perspective, the causes of the Great Schism were the Bishop of Rome taking authority which it did not have claim to could not in good faith claim based off the first 1,000 years of the church and apostolic tradition, coupled with the addition of the filioque to the creed. And that's sort of what got the ball rolling on the schism and led the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome, to excommunicate each other. And this was not exactly an overnight thing. There were other churches like Antioch, like Alexandria, which did not necessarily follow suit right away. And indeed, it would take, to my knowledge, in some cases, a number of centuries, actually, before what is now all the Eastern Orthodox churches would officially sever ties with Rome. But it was rooted in kind of these two primary issues of the papacy and the filioque.
And just to preface that, someone's already mentioned in the chat the fact that the other great schism to mention, of course, is the Chalcedonian schism between the Miaphysites,
Yes.
who then go off to become the Oriental churches. And you mentioned the patriarchal sees of Antioch and Alexandria. And I've mentioned elsewhere on the channel how there is almost an overabundance of schisms and counter-schisms regarding those particular patriarchal sees. The case in Antioch, I think you have 5 claimants to be Patriarch of Antioch based on what communion you are with which church. But when we're focusing on this stream, it's not focusing on the entire church, albeit, interestingly enough, there were Ethiopian and there were Armenian delegates sent to the Council of Florence in the 1430s. And there was also proclaimed another union with those churches, but nothing quite as substantive.
Yeah.
And we have to use substantive and inverted commas when we talk about the union between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches. So the purview for this discussion is the union between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And by the Orthodox Church which is also in communion with Constantinople, which is again another question in and of itself. But you've come at this from the theological standpoint and also regarding the church hierarchy. Now, Marcus here Furious Pertinax has been very patient and allowing both of us to speak. Now, I'm sure because you've been on so many streams on this channel, everyone's already familiar with you. But nevertheless, I want to have you introduce yourself as well, Marcus, but also to ask the question from the point of view of a Byzantist. What do you believe are other reasons which perhaps contributed to the Great Schism in 1054?
Indeed. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And of course, lovely to speak to Mr. Patriarch again. Has been a while. And good to be back on the channel, actually. It's been a long while for me. But yes, as the resident Byzantist or Byzantophile, I think it's worth considering here that there's some ecclesiastical factors at play, and there's also more temporal factors at play. Now, I don't think it necessarily influences the schism directly, but I think we should also take into account, because Mr. Patriarch has quite aptly laid out sort of some of the bases of the schism that occurs in 1054, and that is that for the if we talk, you mentioned Constantine the Great and the transition of Rome as an imperial entity from being a pagan society and culture and becoming a Christian one. And this also coincides with the fact that Rome is the center of power, has been the center of power in Rome, well, I mean, it is the Roman state. Rome was founded in 753 BC, thereabouts. Was a republic, became an empire. It was the center of this nation for such a long time, only for Constantine to then basically create his new capital in what was Byzantium in the east, modern-day Istanbul. And as a city that grew very rapidly and basically became this hub of power in the east, straddling Asia and Europe. And of course, with the establishment of the Pentarchy, what do we have? We have 5 heads of the church, one in Rome, one in Constantinople, one in Alexandria and Antioch, and Jerusalem, of course. Yeah. So, and insofar there was a unified empire that was led by an emperor, I've been of the belief anyway that the maintenance of a pentarchy was not impossible. But with the sort of the disintegration of Rome, certainly the loss of the western half, you already sort of have some intractable differences between what are the sort of spiritual factors at play regarding the status of the churches and the various pentarchs, and also then their more temporal considerations and concerns. Because what we kind of have is already some kind of discord between East and West with the crowning of Charlemagne and him being nominated as Roman emperor, even though there's an emperor, Empress Irene, who was ruling in Constantinople. And this is, you're talking 9th century here. So this precedes the Great Schism by, about 1.5 centuries, say, give or take. And already that creates a massive discord between the various parties at play, only to then, you roll up to 1054 and the creation of the filioque, and you already have this tension between East and Western churches. And then this is just sort of like another disagreement that essentially is of an ecclesiastical nature, but it has also this underpinning of East and West churches are now diverging culturally. They've diverged linguistically as well, and then of course it sort of seems almost petty that one of the arguments that they have is over the status of the Eucharist, and having an argument rather than crying over spilt milk, they're crying over unleavened bread. In essence, and that's one of the base of disagreement. But in the end, was that a superficial thing? Maybe not. But because I believe it was Leo IX, if memory says it correct, who was Pope at the time, and the Patriarch Michael Kerolarios, essentially from this minor dispute, then escalate with each other to the point where, as you've said, Mr. Patriarch, they excommunicate each other. And you can't but help. Is this purely an ecclesiastical question, or is this an ecclesiastical question overlaid or underlaid with physical temporal factors regarding the status of Italy at the time as this sort of decentralized political entity that's divided between Lombards, a Byzantine remnant, various sort of like Italian principalities, and at this point the establishment of the maritime republics, Amalfi and Genoa and Venice, they're starting to achieve a basis of power in Italy. And then sort of in the east you still have this relatively strong, because you remember this is pre-Manzikert, a relatively strong Eastern Empire. Remember, Manzikert's 1071. That's the disintegration of the Eastern army at the hands of the Turks. This occurs in 1054. So the Eastern Empire is still quite strong. They're sort of at the tail end of the Macedonian dynasty, and have just reincorporated a number of territories and had something of a mini, you might say, like rejuvenation, a mini golden era of sorts. So the Great Schism occurs in flux of these considerations too. I hope that sort of touches AM on what you were alluding to from the Byzantine standpoint.
Well, it also, it goes into the first article I have prepared, that specific point about the imperial aspect, which you're drawing explicit reference to. But there's something else which I need to mention, because it almost seems so obvious that it's not the first thing that comes to mind. Instead, we come up with these more grandiose explanations about the nature of Christ and the nature of the Christian empire. Well, actually, I'm thinking of something as basic as the liturgy. The fact that the West is by and large Latin and the East is by and large Greek. And indeed, when we have the the introduction of the glagolific alphabet and Saint Methodius, and then the great court center of Plevny in the Tsardom of Bulgaria. Then, of course, we have Cyrillic, and we have the Slavonic liturgy that comes out of that. So again, it's this idea of, is liturgy, is language also a major contributor to, you can say, the mutual unintelligibility of these two sides of the church, which is basically
divergence of
yes,
sorts.
which is confirming a fact that existed within the Roman Empire for most of its history. The eastern part of the empire never Latinized to the extent that Greek came out of favor in terms of lingua franca. And
sorry, just to say, to which point, and let's not also forget that the last emperor of a unified empire, of a unified Roman Empire that had dominion of East and West, was Theodosius. And you're sort of talking at the very end of the, well, I think Theodosius, just is at the very end of the 300s. So you're talking, 600 years removed from the last time that Rome and Byzantium or Constantinople were a part of a well-maintained unified empire. Yes, there's the technical reconquest by Justinian in the 5th century, the 500s, but that isn't solid. That's not a lasting gain. In the end, once the empire is broken apart and severed, you have this cultural and linguistic, differentiation between East and West that only grows over time.
Indeed, and the reason I want to bring up, and you brought up again, the idea of the precarious nature of the secular authority, because just to reference, everyone talks about Constantine, but Mr. Patriarch brought up the fact that it was the Nicene Constantinople Creed, which was overseen by the Emperor Theodosius. Theodosius, who was essentially, has to be remembered, the sole official Christian emperor over the entire empire and its entire history. That really needs to be emphasized in terms of the actual brief span which Christianity had in terms of being able to establish its hold over both empires. Because after that, we have the permanent divide in the empire. And before that, in the time between Constantine and Theodosius, you have this bizarre period where you have these semi-Arian emperors, and then you have the rise of Julian, Emperor Julian, of course, who the Christians refer to as Julian the Apostate. So just to emphasize that again, because it also confirms my point about the liturgy, which is a secular argument which Arnold Toynbee brings up, which is the argument of, okay, who were the first to enter into schism? Well, it's also the first who had a national church, and there was a national church outside of the Roman Empire, which was Armenia. We talk about the Chalcedonian opposition, the Miaphysites, whatever, but an aspect here too also is the fact that is an aspect of Armenian nationalism against domination by the emperor in Constantinople and Rome, again, which you can say confirms these differences, in the same way that Ethiopia also is never part of the Roman Empire. So it's interesting to consider that the absence of political authority on the fringes basically allows for these doctrinal deviations regarding the nature of Christology effectively to develop. So that's a very important point, but I wanted to come back to the liturgy because it actually has some bearing on what's going on today in the church. And it's actually quite interesting that this is all happening at this time, because I contacted you a while ago, Mr. P, about organizing the stream, but since then we've had a new pope, and one of the interesting things that the Pope decided to do when he first decided to erupt onto Twitter. Again, I can't believe I'm saying that. But it sounds so surreal. But the first few appeals he made outside of his official masses were appeals to the Oriental churches. I believe the first sort of cluster selection of tweets were referencing the significance of the Eastern liturgies. In particular, he brings in the example of his namesake, which he has done so repeatedly so far, Leo XIII, who was Pope at the end of the 19th century, which is reference to the idea that any Latin Rite missionary, whether a member of the secular or regular clergy, who by advice or support draws any Eastern Rite Catholic to the Latin Rite, ought to be dismissed and removed from his office. There seems to be this great reverence going back to the example set forth by Louis XIII, which is the enunciation of a previous position going back for centuries. How is it essentially that you have this great liturgical divide at the beginning, and yet you also have these things which are non-Latin Rite Catholics, Eastern Rite Catholics, that these come out of a different union of the churches, the Union of Brest, which occurred in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 16th century, not nearly of the same, you can say, in terms of its significance, in terms of the worldwide ramifications going forward, it's a lesser union considering the implications of the Council of Florence, because we're not talking about the worldwide union of the two major churches at that time. Instead, we're talking about the union of a group of Orthodox living under the rule of a Catholic ruler in Poland. So again, you mentioned that point earlier, Marcus, about the significance of having some sort of secular authority to bridge the gap between East and West in terms of the religious divide. It seems that within Poland and Lithuania in the 16th century, 150 years after this conversation, we have a microcosm of that. And it's the legacy of that microcosm which effectively exists today and will effectively reinforce the ideas of the Pope whenever he uses his motto, which is in illo uno unum, which in the one we are one, which of course is referencing St. Augustine and referencing one with Christ, but also he means oneness, of course, in terms of the unity of the church, or basically reapply the implications of that whenever it comes to a specific occasion. But nevertheless, that is the emphasis he decided to place on his sort of you can say his own sort of internal missionary work during the Catholic Church, was to appeal to the legacy of the Union of the Breast and the Eastern Rite Catholics. So there is within the Catholic Church today an example of what you can see of this union piecemeal. But of course, we're talking about something which was perhaps more significant, but of course failed to materialize. But it's here that I want to come back to the ideas really that Marcus was putting forward about the whole nature of how does Byzantium figure into this whole argument, because you can't talk about the union of the churches without talking about the nature of the Byzantine Empire and the fall of Rome. This can't be the fall of the Eastern Rome. This can't be a theological discussion explicitly. And also, I don't believe I would be the best qualified to have a exclusively theological discussion. But that again makes it so much more interesting. The fact that there are so many political and cultural arguments and contexts that one needs to apply to this. Sorry, I thought someone was going to say something.
I don't know.
No,
sorry, go back.
Go ahead, first. Okay.
No.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I definitely agree. I think there is, I think a lot of these, from what I can tell, a lot of these issues are bound up together. The theological issues with the political issues, with the recognition of a new Western emperor under Charlemagne, and the addition of the filioque, partially as sort of maybe a way to sort of get other churches on side and sort of recognize the legitimacy of the Western half, and the nationalist element of like the Armenian and Ethiopian churches. All these are bound up together, and they do affect sort of what is all going to play out over time. So, me as an Orthodox guy, I'll say, that the church is led by the Holy Spirit and stuff, and thus, will be preserved for all time. However, it is 100% possible within the Orthodox paradigm that individual bishop, there is no bishop who may not fall away, right? So even within the Eastern Orthodox world right now, we are seeing issues of a very similar sort, I would say, play out today with the church in Ukraine and sort of the nationalistic forces sort of at play there, palace intrigues, and desires for certain groups to assert their autonomy over what they see as a sort of a foreign, in this case, Muscovite patriarchate, and sort of the problems that are rooted in an issue of ethnos, of historical grievance and ambition, sort of intersect with the faith, and that's where you see a lot of these very entangling and complicated issues come up. It's all bound up together. It's not just theological. It's also these political and the historic forces at work.
I mean, one thing I mentioned again over and over on this channel is the idea of autocephaly, but also you combine the theological predisposition of, say, for example, the Patriarch in Moscow, and contrast that with the Patriarch in Constantinople. It's all very interesting beyond looking at just the Ukrainian angle. But I want to, again, tie this back and focus on Byzantium first before we get to the chronology of the Council of Florence. And something which I find very interesting, because Marcus, you've already alluded to, is the fact that we can't. It's something that the article is going to bring up in some respects, but we can't even really think of a Byzantine Empire without it being defined in opposition to the papacy. I mean, there are many sort of attempts to categorize Roman history. I've done my own various attempts on this channel, but as far as I can see it, obviously Byzantium is post hoc, created by Hieronymus Wolff in the 16th century, but nevertheless, I think it's very useful, demarcated to some extent. Not if we're looking at the empire as it was, say, for example, during the reign of Theodosius, or during the reign of Justinian, or during the reign even of Heraclius, but say, for example, during like the reign of Leo the Isaurian, because it's during that time that you have the diocese in Rome being divested of all of its holdings in Greece. You have the loss of the Exarchate of Ravenna. The Pope is no longer protected by the Eastern Emperor. The Eastern Emperor embarks on this iconoclastic fervor, which the Church in Rome completely rejects. And then the Pope goes looking for another secular protector. And this ultimately ends up in the form of Pepin, but that will coalesce into Charlemagne and the coronation of the Western Emperor, and then the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. So I think, again, if we're looking at Orthodoxy as a cultural and political construct, you can almost say that as so much of what would later become Latin Christianity is focused on the figure of the Pope, so much of the focus of Orthodoxy is not necessarily on the patriarch, but very much on the figure of the emperor. And so as the emperor becomes reduced in his authority, reduced to the environs of Constantinople, to Greece, to Anatolia, and then that territory will degrade over time, so too you can say the whole concept of Orthodoxy is again defined in opposition to that. And you can say informed by that breach that we see in the 8th century. In many ways, you can say that we look to the Great Schism, you look to the example of Leo IX and the excommunication and the counter-excommunication in 1054, but really I believe you have to look to those steps taken in the 8th century. So this article is called "You Cannot Have an Empire, a Church Without an Empire" by James C. Skedros, and it's linked in the description. It's open access if you want to read it for yourself. At the end of the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a handful of possessions, consisting of a depopulated city of Constantinople, a few port towns in nearby Thrace, the independent empire of Trebizond on the southern coast of the Black Sea, some northern Aegean islands, and parts of the Greek Peloponnesus. The grandeur, military might, and economic dominance that had once made Byzantium the envy of the medieval world was gone. By 1371, Emperor John V Palaeologus had begun to pay an annual tribute to the more powerful Ottoman Sultan. It is rather remarkable that Byzantium would survive for another 3 generations. Yet even within such a bleak political and military existence, the rhetoric of empire continued. In 1393, Antony, Patriarch of Constantinople, penned a letter to Basil I, Grand Prince of Moscow. Antony had learned that the Muscovite prince was not offering the liturgical commemoration of the Byzantine Emperor Emmanuel II Palaeologus. In his oft-quoted letter, Patriarch Antony expresses his dismay at such an oversight and expresses the conventional imperial ideology of Byzantium. My son, it is not possible for Christians to have a church and not have an empire. Church and empire have a great unity and community. It is not possible for them to be separated from one another, for the Holy Emperor is not as other rulers, and the governors of other regions are, and in this is because the emperors, from the beginning, established and confirmed the true religion, Eusebia, in all the inhabited worlds, oikomene. They convoked ecumenical councils, and they struggled hard against heresies. Though not part of the imperial orbit of the dwindling Eastern Roman Empire, Moscow was, at the very least, a member of the larger Christian Orthodox world. The Orthodox oikomene that had already begun to replace the soon-to-be defunct political entity on the Bosporus, and as such Moscow, in Patriarch Antony's view, ought to remember and pray for the emperor. In a clear reference to the first Christian emperor, Antony argued that the emperors had always been involved in defining orthodox doctrines over and against misguided teachings. Though written within the context of ecclesiastical relations between Constantinople and the Metropolitanate of Russia, Antony's letter offers a succinct exposition of the imperial responsibilities as defender of orthodoxy. Again, it's interesting because this conversation regarding, you could say, the legacy that this union has in terms of its reverberations on Greek and Russian identity. I think it's very obvious to say that thanks to the consolidation of Moscow as a state during the 14th century, especially by the time of the Council of Florence in the 1430s, it begins as the Council of Basel. That goes horribly wrong. It moves to Ferrara and then ultimately moves to Florence. But during this time, the state of Muscovy, even though it's entangled in various civil wars, has far and away eclipsed Byzantium as the most powerful of all of the Orthodox states. And of course, it'll endure and only ensure that legacy throughout the remaining centuries, and ultimately up until today, as you basically brought up, Mr. Patriarch. But again, it's this going back to this idea that even though, as we talked about, the idea of the secular authority of the emperor and how that affects the unity of Christendom, there is still this reverence within Orthodoxy for the figure of the emperor. And I would argue that this is not non-existent, but significantly less when you compare it to the example of Latin Christianity or Catholic Christianity, because the investiture controversy has happened. The conflict between the Guelphs supporting the Pope and the Ghibelline supporting the Emperor has essentially resolved itself in a way which is ultimately favorable to the Pope. Even though that we have the Western Schism or whatever, the Pope is a figure of far sort of greater, not just esteem, but essential in terms of all of theological implications compared to the figure of the emperor. The emperor in the Western context may actually be more powerful than the Eastern Roman emperor, but there seems to be an essential link between the empire and orthodoxy that has, you can say, I wouldn't say gone, but nevertheless it has been somewhat superseded when it comes to the context of Western Christianity because of the effects of the investor controversy and the religious wars between the Pope and the Emperor over religious and secular supremacy during the medieval period. It's just quite interesting to consider that. I want, if you have any contributions, to make them, so I'm not just rambling on incessantly like an old man.
No, just to sort of, I guess, sort of add on to your point, the reason that today so some people confuse the Patriarch of Constantinople as sort of analogous to the Pope in the Orthodox world. He is not, but he is given a high degree of honor exactly because of what you said, AM, because Constantinople was the seat of the Christian Imperium for, quite a long time. And because of this heritage, this sort of imperial legacy, and the importance that Constantinople played within the empire, and the fact that you had so many great saints from Constantinople, including John Chrysostom, who authored the liturgy that Orthodox still use to this day. There is a reverence for this imperial past there is a reverence for Constantinople and the Patriarch because of this imperial past, as you say. So, and that is also sort of inherited to a certain extent by Moscow, right? So the third Rome, as it were, and the importance of the Moscow Patriarchate, particularly in Eastern Europe. So there is a definite link between the importance of the imperial heritage and sort of respect for these different sees. And you do see something kind of like this, I would say, in Catholicism, but it is different in kind because the seat of power that Rome used to be had long since, eroded and was never really reclaimed later on. The seat of power would shift, of imperial power in Europe would shift over time. So you'd have the Habsburgs and Charles V, And then
and by that time, the imperial idea was really in its death throes. Charles V really is this last hurrah, if anything else.
Exactly. Yeah, he's the last hurrah of sort of like a unified Catholic imperium. And you do have it exist to some degree, like with the Habsburgs later on, and then afterwards the Austro-Hungary, sort of in the last day, are sort of the last days and vestiges of this sort of imperial Catholic monarchy.
The last
but the
sort of
power
thing
is never in Rome.
Yes, the last thing you can really point to is when Emperor Franz Joseph uses his veto during a papal conclave in 1903. That last sort of lingering remnant of the Catholic Empire using that right to veto a specific papal candidate, but nevertheless, even at that time, it's considered unconscionable, and basically all the cardinals agree that from henceforth. In any future conclave, that will not be considered a factor. Then, of course, World War I happens, and then the empire ceases to exist, and since then, there has not been a Catholic emperor. But again, there is an aspect to your argument where you're right. Again, it's the fact that one wasn't residing in Rome. The symphonia didn't exist between the ecclesiastical and the political power in one center, effectively. And just to illustrate your point again, I mean, you mentioned the novelty of Constantinople being associated explicitly as the imperial see. Well, obviously, Constantinople as a city didn't exist during the time of Christ, whereas the 4 other patriarchal sees did exist. And so St. Andrew is retroactively considered the patron saint of Constantinople, and the apostolic succession originates from him, even though Constantinople did not exist at that time. But of course, its significance, despite being at that time the youngest of all the patriarchal sees, is due again to its association with the figure of the emperor. Marcus, any thoughts on this?
No, I don't really have much to add. I think you guys have covered it fairly aptly. The only thing I would say is, just because we've touched on the Orthodox question and the sort of the role of Russia and Byzantium, is that given the sort of eventual erosion, particularly in the post 1204 sort of world of the Eastern Empire, which is the Fourth Crusade and the sack of the city, there's obviously, although Byzantium does retain this sort of residual legacy authority, and of course it remains the seat of the patriarchy in the city, or certainly once they reconquered the city during the reign of Michael Paleologos. What was it, 12? I'm trying to think what decade it was. Like 1250 1260,
I think.
That's right. Yeah. And obviously there's sort of like a brief rejuvenation, but then the sort of that eventually that decline becomes terminal, which you quite aptly described in that excerpt that you just mentioned about the few possessions that they hold come the arrival of the 15th century, and so one can't help that there's this sort of natural movement of the center mass of Orthodoxy away from the Aegean northwards. And I'm just reading in the chat here, someone mentioned about how weren't the Muscovites just fur catchers at this point? I mean, in the end, that would be true for sort of like earlier, maybe a couple centuries prior. But by the arrival of 1500s, especially once they break away from the Mongol yoke, Muscovy does become a leading power in the east. And with the fall of the city in 1453, and the annexation of its fringe territories by the middle part of the 1453, and the annexation of its various fringe territories by sort of the end of the 1460s, there is really no other standout Orthodox national entity or cultural entity. That gravity moves away from the Aegean Hellenics to the Russians in the north, and I think that's also solidified by. Oh, sorry, just to say, it's also solidified too by the marriage of one of the last princesses of the empire, Sophia Paleologos, to the crown prince.
Well, that's going to form a I would say an epilogue to the stream. So some really interesting implications behind that. But there's an elephant in the room. which we're jumping around with the chronology, but this is fine because this is more of a thematically focused stream. But I mentioned Leo the Isaurian, we've mentioned Constantine, we've mentioned the Great Schism, we've mentioned the state of the church in the state of the empire in the 1260s, we've mentioned the investor controversy. What haven't we mentioned?
Well, I just mentioned the Fourth Crusade, but I don't know whether you're tailing onto
Mongols?
that.
Well, no, but it's both those elements. It's the fact that during the 13th century, the church was basically de facto united in the sense that there was a Latin emperor, and the fact that the Muscovite princelings were so much on the fringes, almost to be completely irrelevant when we talk about Alexander Nevsky and the scions of Daniel, which basically go off to form the princes of Moscow. But that more in the context of not just in terms of the deterioration of the status of Orthodox princely states, but this is also again reinforcing what you can see to be completely unassailable opposition from the Greeks, the Orthodox Greeks, versus the Latins, and how they perceive them basically as foreign conquerors, and how out of this situation, and how out of the belated Paleologos restoration, how any restoration could be seen to be possible. Of course, we see it under a situation of extreme duress, but I just want to finish this article first, just to emphasize the significance of the emperor. Byzantine emperors had a long tradition as defenders and protectors of the faith, dating back to the enshrined deeds of the first Christian emperor Constantine. Imperial proclamations in support of the early ecumenical councils made this role abundantly clear. Emperors were generally required to profess their doctrinal orthodoxy at their coronation, the first attestation of such profession being that of Anastasius. The Byzantine emperors held the authority and the right to call ecumenical councils and to enforce synodal and canonical decisions made by the Church. Further emperors, most famously Justinian and Leo VI, promulgated legislation that was directly related to the affairs of the Church. Regarding issues of dogma, emperors were expected to defend the Church against the encroachments of heresy. Though key concepts in the self-definition of the Christian Church, the constructs of heresy and orthodoxy, were not exclusive domains of the Byzantine Church, but were at work in creating a sustaining imperial ideology as well. There's an aspect, of course, which he actually mentioned, the defense of encroachments against heresy. He mentioned Justinian the First, he mentions Leo VI, but he, interestingly enough, I think, because it would confuse his argument, he omits Heraclius. And the reason Heraclius is interesting, of course, because he involves himself in a great religious contrivance between the Chalcedonian and the Monophysite factions in the empire, and introduces his own vein of thinking called monotelitism. And it's significant in the fact that it basically has no purchase at all today and was repudiated by both sides. So it's not just the fact that the emperor...
With grave consequences for the empire, of course.
Grave consequences. So it's not just the fact that the emperor has the authority to defend against heresy, but the emperor is pride of place to necessarily introduce a huge amount of religious confusion if that position basically goes awry, which is what happened. And the reason I bring that up exactly is to bring some sort of tenuous example, perhaps to the association we can perhaps draw between a figure like Heraclius, again, during a period of great strife of the empire, and a figure like John VIII, Paleologos. The idea that the emperor, despite this great vaunted position as defender of orthodoxy, cannot be infallible in the way that we perhaps see these great sort of theological innovations or elements of heterodoxy being inserted. So yes, I think this is time to get to the Union of Florence, but just again to illustrate the fact that this is during a time of the post-schism, of post-Fourth Crusade. We have all of these Latin princes, the princes of Epirus, Italian families, French families. There's a Neapolitan claim on things like Albania. There are all of these little Venetian communes. The Venetians at one point also held on to control of Thessalonica, which was the second great city of the empire. And the empire itself, the Byzantine Empire itself, has been reduced to enclaves in the Peloponnese, around Morea, and the center of power in the Morea, which is Mistra, which is basically the second capital of the empire, by necessity, because the empire is now non-continuous because it's been split off by the Ottomans. And then, of course, the enclave around Constantinople itself. So it's not just the fact that there is opposition to the Turks, but of course there is the lingering elements everywhere. The Fourth Crusade happened. The Venetians have all of these enclaves all around these places. The Venetians promised they were going to defend Thessalonica against the Turks, and of course that goes disastrously. So they're not just the Orthodox Christians within the Eastern Roman Empire. They're not just faced with the legacy of the vilification of Islam, but also with the legacy of their fraught relationships with Catholic Christendom as well. Because you're right when you bring up the example of Michael Marcus, that this was a brief rejuvenation for the empire. It was a repudiation of the Latin emperors, but one thing he was unable to achieve was the reunification of the empire, even up to the point you can say of the restoration period of the Emperor Alexios or Emperor Manuel or Emperor John Komnenos or anything like that. Areas are completely split off forever, and the empire is never reunited into an entity which can basically say to the whole world, Greece is united, at least, not the world, not the great oikomene, not the the homonoia of all peoples everywhere. Just Greece, just us Greece, can go and proclaim
the Hellenic sphere.
The Hellenic civilization can proclaim that we are Orthodox. They can't even claim that. So Michael is able to hold on to a piece of Hellenic civilization, Greek Orthodox civilization, but they're not even able to achieve that in the centuries that follow from the Fourth Crusade. Such is the disaster which that event basically wreaks havoc in terms of the whole history of that region.
Well, especially if you're talking the context of Michael Carolarius and the actual event of the schism in 1054, as I'd mentioned previously, you have to take into account that from this is obviously a discussion about ecclesiastical matters, not military ones. I won't harp on too much, but Manzikert occurs in 1071 under Romanos Diogenes, and there's a complete collapse of the eastern frontier, and essentially what it ends up being over the next decade and a half, the eventual almost total occupation of Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks, who sort of arrive in, from the east and ends up overrunning the defenses of the empire, and for a number of myriad of reasons end up sort of occupying large tracts of Anatolia, which obviously triggers the events of the First Crusade. Alexios comes to the throne and at the beginning of the Komnenon dynasty, and we sort of have the events that follow from that. But what prior to Manzikert and prior to 1054 and the schism is that you have essentially a century and a half of this Byzantine rejuvenation. You've got to think this is a nation. This is a nation and an empire that is battered by the after effects of the great Heraclian, the final Roman-Persian War, and then 2 centuries of being exactly well, in this case especially being particularly battered by the forces of the Caliphate, by the Rashid and later Umayyad Caliphate, and essentially being hemmed in behind the Taurus Mountains, and being able to defend like this rump state around Anatolia and parts of Greece. By the arrival of the 11th century, as we get into the sort of the 1000s, we've seen this a period of stability and consolidation by the Phrygian dynasty, which are the dynasty which are responsible for the iconoclasm, which is sort of its own separate issue. But they do manage to hold the empire together, and then you have this period of reconquest and of rejuvenation and strengthening under the Macedonian dynasty, and it's sort of it's greatly embodied by these sort of soldier emperors in the case of John Zimisces and Nicephorus Phocas, etc. And this is an empire that now has strength and self-belief, and Constantinople is not just this sort of fading light of a dying empire. It's actually the beating heart of a nation and a society that is strong and self-confident again, which I think does play into, to some degree, this sort of if I could call it, ecclesiastical self-confidence of the clergy within Constantinople. And I think the actions of Michael Carolarius exemplify that to a point. But then, of course, this is only mere decades prior to these successional disasters. You have Manzikert in 1071, the initiation of the First Crusade, that obviously passed through Constantinople in the 1090s, and then of course you have the disastrous consequences of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and then the ramifications which follow thereafter. This sort of all exists on a very relevant timeline.
Well, it's the specific element of the fact that the idea that the Eastern Empire is this bulwark of Christianity in the East is something that isn't new. Like I said, if we're going to look at Leo the Isaurian as some sort of demarcation point, his whole claim to legitimacy effectively is being able to hold the empire together against the siege of the Umayyads in the early 8th century. But what makes the Fourth Crusade significant compared to the incursions of the Turks is the fact that this has been undertaken by a Catholic crusade. The issue is, of course, that Innocent III, the then Pope, and one of the most significant of all of the popes of the medieval period, understands how disastrous this is in the long term. But of course, he has to and of course, he excommunicated the crusade at one point during the attack of Zara, when it became clear that the crusaders were following the political objectives of the Republic of Venice and not the objectives of the crusade. But nevertheless,
and specifically the designs of Dandolo as well.
Yes, but specifically, he has to recognize the fact, okay, well, this is a disaster, but we also have Catholic princes now ruling over all of Greece. I need to confirm this fact. So, yes, it's not ideal, but the Pope is basically consolidating a position which has been presented to him. It's not the ideal situation for Catholics by any means to have achieved this by this means. And of course, it's going to haunt the legacy of relations between Catholics and the Orthodox going forward. But I mean, you mentioned one idea, which is the argument of Byzantine decline, but I also want to bring up a counter argument, which actually makes it uniquely possible for an event like this to occur, i.e. the union of the churches from the Byzantine side, because we also need to understand Catholic weakness, papal weakness during this period. Because we're not talking about the era of the emboldened papacy of, say, for example, I don't know, Sixtus V during the late 16th century, and the admonitions against Queen Elizabeth and the Armada and all of that sort of thing. No, what we're talking about is a papacy which has been riven by internal schism. We talk about the Great Schism between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, between the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople and the Pope in Rome. We don't talk about the schism, or not perhaps as much, but of course many people watching this will be fully aware of it. The schism between Avignon and Rome, and then Avignon, Rome, and Pisa at the same time. During the beginning, yes, well, two anti-popes. During the beginning of the 15th century, there were three popes reigning concurrently, to the point that there was a major controversy when, what was it, in 1958, when John the 23rd chose that name. He had to basically say implicitly by choosing 23rd and not 24th, that he declared the previous John the 23rd to be an anti-pope by extension. But that again is the
null and voided a prior pope in essence.
Yes, in the process. But that again basically emphasizes the fact that even though there is major turmoil in Greece, even though the Paleologos dynasty itself is riven by factionalism and civil wars between the various brothers and prelates, because there's a succession crisis amid everything else, the popes are basically facing the same situation. There is an incredibly weak empire. It takes an emperor who is relatively strong compared to his predecessors and immediate successor Sigismund to initiate the process behind the Council of Constance, which allows for the voluntary renunciation of two of the popes to allow for one pope to emerge, Pope Martin V, during the course of the 1410s and the 1420s. That again is all to say that the whole idea that the Pope is this commanding, imperious presence over all of Christendom, holding all of the states in direct vassalage, like Innocent III, would claim, say, for example, over King John in the early 13th century, that time is well beyond us. There is this kernel within the whole arguments of the ecumenical councils at the time that the council assembled has preeminence over the Pope. And this would actually go back to your point, Mr. Patriarch, earlier, that the Pope basically is seen as an appellate authority. He's seen as a mediator with a special preeminence within the church, but does not claim, for example, papal supremacy, papal infallibility. These are the arguments which are being regurgitated within the Latin church, let alone in terms of the context between the Orthodox and the Catholic positions. The idea that it's all of the higher ranking clergy assembled have preeminence over a pope. and the idea that they have the right to convoke their own councils on a regular basis, and they have the right essentially to excommunicate popes, which is what happened at the Council of I believe at the Council of Basel and Pope Eugenius. And there had to be this long process again, even within that, towards another reconciliation before there was another Western Schism formed. So a weak papacy is essentially being confronted with a weak emperor. And you can say it's in this position that we would be wrong to characterize both sides as basically one is demanding unequivocal concession and submission from the other, because that is not the position. In fact, one of the arguments essentially made that could be placed in the favor of the Greek camp or the Orthodox camp is the idea that the emperor coming to Ferrara, to Venice, to Florence, could act as a great boon to the legitimacy of a pope, should he concede the right to basically accept this pope's authority effectively. So it's not simply a matter of, oh, we're desperate, we're in the situation where we're being enveloped by the Ottomans, we need your help. No, the Emperor of Constantinople coming over to basically declare that, Pope Eugenius has genuine ecclesiastical authority, that he can basically appeal to the legacy of his medieval predecessors before de Nogaret, before the Avignon captivity of the popes in the 14th century. All of these things are going on. This is a great period of internal turmoil for Christendom, and of course it's not resolved really ever, because this process does not result in the triumph of an ascendant papacy over all of Christendom, but ultimately leads to the events that we have the Protestant Reformation as well. So all of these things to take in consideration in terms of the environment that we have for the union of the churches. Yes, and Renaissance Man is saying, yes, the conciliarist view was held heretical at Vatican I. Yes, but Vatican I was in 1870. Yeah, we're talking about 400
centuries before,
centuries prior. The Catholic Church and ultramontanism and all this, it was in a fundamentally different position. Where, as we see with the Union of Churches, these sort of political and ecclesiastical modifications seem possible. But I'm reading a segment from John Julius Norwich's Byzantium. This episode is the Decline and Fall, specifically on his reference to the Council of Constance. So, starting off this segment, the Council of Constance, which I've referenced, had failed to effect any real reforms. Indeed, in at least one respect, it had done more harm than good, since it had declared itself to be a general council with an authority directly from God, and was consequently superior to that of the Pope himself. This had dangerously intensified the already existing dispute between those who supported such a view and those who believed in absolute papal supremacy, to a point where it began to present a serious threat to church discipline. And it was largely in an attempt to settle the matter once and for all that Pope Martin V summoned a new council to meet in Basel. To John Palaiologos, the emperor who we've mentioned various times, John VIII, who was the penultimate emperor, he was the older brother of the famous Constantine XI. This council seemed to offer a ray of hope. Once again, as at Constance, representatives of all the Christian nations of the West will be present. And although their reactions on the previous occasion had been disappointing to say the least, much had happened in the past 15 years to make them change their minds. Venice, in particular, had been brought face to face with Turkish arms at Thessalonica and had suffered serious damage, not only to her financial and strategic interests, but far more important, to her international and strategic interests, to her prestige. Sigismund of Hungary, by the way, is also the emperor, too, had watched powerless during the previous summer as the Sultan of the Ottomans marched from Thessalonica right across the Balkan Peninsula to Epirus, accepted the surrender of Ioannina without much struggle, and passed on, Ionia, and then without much struggle passed on through Albania, pushing the frontiers of the empire further and further back towards Sigmund's own borders in Hungary. This time, perhaps a Byzantine appeal might fall on more receptive ears, and where Venice and Hungary led, others would surely follow. The Emperor John was also intrigued by the conflict over the authority of the general councils. Virtually all recent attempts at church union had founded on a similar issue, the Byzantines insisting on a council to be held at Constantinople, the Latins refusing to consider such a proposal. Might there not potential allies among the conciliarists capable of last swinging opinion in their favor? And again, this idea that the whole notion that the emperor has the right to convoke the council. So wouldn't it be a great boon for the prestige of the emperor if, in a concession, he isn't convoking the council, the Pope is the one convoking the council, but a concession is that we hold it in the Byzantine capital, almost to make it seem as if that this is being held on some sort of joint initiative between the Pope and the emperor. Of course, we know that this is almost diplomatically impossible. I mean, can you imagine just before the fall of Constantinople, all of the great, princes of the church and princes from all of these other states gathered in Constantinople, while the Sultan Murad is just surrounding? Of course, this isn't just preposterous in terms of the sort of hierarchical implications of the church, but this is preposterous in terms of just the safety of all of these people.
Well, also the I was going to say the practicality of it. That by that point in time, Constantinople was not a safe place for the Byzantines themselves. Never mind for any guests. Whilst the rapidly growing Ottoman sort of Sultanate was sort of slowly slipping its noose around the city in the early to mid 1400s.
The imperial ambassadors arriving at the papal court in the late summer of 1431 found tensions running high. There's also another interesting angle, which is I think I've mentioned this on my stream when I covered Charles V, that whenever the emperor basically is confronted with a theological dispute, which ultimately he has to work around for the maintenance of his own authority, this idea of conciliarism comes up and informs basically the current moment, as in the emperor can appeal to the right of the bishops over that of a supreme pontiff. The imperial ambassadors arriving at the papal court in the late summer of 1431 found tensions running high. Pope Martin had died at that point, and his successor, Eugene IV, in a desperate attempt to assert his authority, had ordered the council to leave Basel and to hold all future sessions in Italy, where he could exercise a firmer control over the delegates. However, they had announced that they were staying where they were. On the 18th of December, Eugene issued a bull dissolving the entire gathering and declaring its deliberations null and void. This time, the delegates simply reaffirmed the decrees issued at Constance, pointing out that they too constituted a general council, i.e. having preeminence over the Pope, although at the time they numbered only 14 of the senior clergy, and that their own authority was consequently paramount. For the next 2 years, the dispute continued, and as it did, so John found himself wooed ever more assiduously by both parties. The council pressing him to send an official delegation to Basel, the Pope equally anxious that he should do nothing of the kind. Again, it's interesting, isn't it, that even with the diminished status of the Orthodox emperor, that there are Catholics in Basel assembled who believe that having some sort of vote of approval from him will be sufficient enough to basically act as a counterbalance to the authority of the Pope. We're not talking about completely insignificant actors here. This isn't just universally considered to be the last gasps of an irrelevant figure.
But the legacy of it carries so much weight still, like you say. Sorry, Patriot.
Oh no, I was just agreeing, 100%.
Finally, in 1433, the emperor took his decision, nominating 3 ambassadors to represent him at the council. When a papal legation arrived to remonstrate, he sent another delegation, this time to Eugenius, and so he continued, playing one side off against the other, until in the summer of 1437, matters finally came to a head. By this time, the Pope had been obliged to revoke his former decision and to recognize the council after all. More important for the emperor, he had also reluctantly accepted what the Byzantines had never ceased to maintain. The true union could only be achieved by means of a council of the whole church, to be attained by representatives of both East and West. To the vast majority of those concerned, however, it was now obvious that this was not to be at Basel. The past 6 years had seen too much ill feeling and bitterness. If the proposed council were to have any chance of success, a fresh start was essential. The more hidebound of the conciliarists objected, in 1439 going so far as to declare the Pope deposed and to elect another anti-Pope. But this arbitrary renewal of a papal schism cost them what little prestige they had left, and one by one the Christian nations submitted to the authority of Eugene. Ideally, The emperor would have wished the new council to be held in Constantinople, but he was obliged to admit that in the circumstances now prevailing, this was no longer possible, as we basically mentioned. He therefore willingly accepted the Pope's choice of Ferrara, confirming that he personally, together with his patriarch, would head the imperial delegation. It's interesting, isn't it, a choice between Ferrara? When I started learning about this, I thought Ferrara, wouldn't it be interesting having a place which is so close to Ravenna, on the east coast, the Adriatic coast of Italy, as if implying some sort of continuity with Ravenna being the traditional seat of the imperial authority within Italy. Just a thought.
Indeed.
Eugene, hearing this welcome news, lost no time. By September, his legates were already in Constantinople to work out the details, while others were negotiating with the Venetians for the hiring of a fleet to bring the Byzantine delegation in proper state to Ferrara. Thus, it was John Palaiologos who once again left his brother Constantine as regent in Constantinople. Of course, him being the last Byzantine emperor. On Wednesday, the 27th of November, 1437, embarked on his historic journey, taking him with a party some 700 strong, among them the most distinguished group of Eastern churchmen ever to visit the West. And this is very much sort of accounted for in the Chapel of the Magi, which the painting of the middle king is actually the thumbnail for the stream today. But all of those paintings are ostensibly, again, inspired by this great Greek party of the empire, which is arriving in Italy in 1437. There was the patriarch himself, Joseph II, nearly 80 years old, crippled by heart disease, but beloved of all who met him. 18 metropolitans, some of them representing his fellow patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and also including the brilliant young metropolitan Bessarion of Nicaea. He's an important figure, which I'll be referring to at the end. Isidore, abbot of the monastery of St. Demetrius in Constantinople, who had attended the Council of Basel and had been promoted in the previous year to Bishop of Kiev and all of Russia, and some 12 other bishops. Even though we have the sack of Kiev by the Ottoman Empire, it has to be noted that Kiev was still technically the most high-ranking city ecclesiastically within the whole sort of nexus of Russian states. Political authority after that had moved to somewhere called Vladimir Suzdal, but Moscow wouldn't achieve its own sort of patriarchal rank until actually after the death of Ivan IV. So we're talking in the late 16th century. Up until that point, we're talking about Kiev technically being the head religiously of the Eastern Orthodox, and indeed in terms of the context of Isidore of Kiev, of Christians, Catholic and Eastern. And this despite it actually being technically part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at this time. Just another interesting thought. Among the laymen were George Scholaris, whose knowledge of Latin theology, and more particularly of the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas, would it was hoped, confound the scholars of the West, and most revered of all, George Gemostos Plethon, himself from Mistra. George Scholaris, very interesting to note because he is Gennadius Scholaris, who would then go on to become the first Ottoman-led patriarch in Constantinople in 1454. And Plethon is basically renowned as one of the, you can say he was a Neoplatonist, but in the sense that he was basically a, I don't know, maybe you can consider him to be the Greek version of a figure like Petrarch. He was almost outrageously heterodox to the point that Scholaris just mentioned destroyed one of his great works on the laws, which actually pioneered some sort of new syncreticist religion of basically founded on Greek polytheism and introducing elements such as Persian Zoroastrianism. This in the context of the middle of the 15th century, where he was a very old man at this point, so much of his work has been destroyed. But Plethon himself is considered a figure associated with this particular procession arriving in Italy, being associated with another rejuvenation of the whole idea of the Renaissance. Just before I move on, do either of you have any particular thoughts regarding Plethon as a character?
No, sir.
Just to say that it's interesting that Plethon and Gennadius Scholarios coexist more or less at the same time. And sort of one is, well, yeah, as we know, Gennadius becomes the first ecumenical patriarch under the Sultanate after the conquest of the city by Mehmed. And at the same time, sort of Platon is a sort of sort of almost the sort of neo-pagan kind of philosopher who harkens back to he harkens back to the classical Greek era, and just that the fact that these two figures coexist, rather dying embers of the empire, I find infinitely fascinating.
And of course, he was the patron of Bessarion, and that in
Indeed.
itself is actually used against Bessarion as some reason to account for why he would be pro-union in the first place. But of course, you were under the supervision of this pagan. Of course, you would believe that sort of thing. If I did say that, I'm really sorry. I meant the Mongols attacking Kiev. If I did say that, as people will know on this channel, I occasionally get things like that confused when I'm in a particular sort of stream of thought that goes in one direction, unfortunately. So do please bear with me. All these were pro-Western to a greater or lesser degree. The leading light of the ultra-Orthodox camp was Mark Eugenicus, Metropolitan of Ephesus, also just known as Mark of Ephesus, one of his church's leading theologians and an implacable opponent of the filioque. He was to cause John much irritation and anxiety in the months that followed. The emperor also took with him his brother Demetrius, to whom in 1429 he had given the title of despot. He did not delude himself that Demetrius would make any effective contribution to the coming debate, but he already knew him for a dangerous intriguer and thought it safer to have him where he could have an eye on him. Subsequent events would prove him right. The party reached Venice on the 8th of February 1438 and anchored off the Lido. This time the Republic was determined to spare no expense in giving the emperor the most splendid reception it could devise. Early the following months, Doge Francesco Foscari came out to greet him, and according to George Soprantes, who was not himself an eyewitness but claims that the despot Demetrius, as his authority, showed him every mark of respect, making a deep obeisance and standing bareheaded, while John remained seated before him. Only after a decent interval did the Doge take a chair specifically set for him at a slightly lower level on the emperor's left, while the two discussed the details of John's ceremonial entrance into the city. Foscari then returned to prepare for the official reception. Again, can you imagine this taking place during the period of Enrico Dandolo? The idea of Foscari showing such a deference to the imperial office. You could almost say that would basically be the deference of a US president still acknowledging the supremacy of the British monarch, wouldn't you? It's just remarkable.
Indeed.
At noon, the Doge, attended, as always, by his six-man Signoria, sailed in his stage barge, the Buncintoro, its sides hung with scarlet damask, the golden lion of St. Mark glinting from the poop, the oarsman's jacket stitched with golden thread. As it advanced, other smaller vessels took up their positions around it, pennants streaming from their mastheads, bands of musicians playing on their decks. Coming alongside the Emperor's flagship, Foscari went aboard and once again made his obeisance. He had originally assumed that the two rulers would then be rowed into the city, but John demurred. His imperial dignity, he considered, made it necessary that he should disembark in Venice from his own vessel. Orders were given accordingly that he should be towed from the Lido to the foot of the Piazzetta. Compared to the Venetians' reception, John's arrival at Ferrara was a lackluster affair, not improved by a pouring rain. Pope Eugenius gave him a warm welcome, but even this was somewhat clouded when the emperor was informed that his patriarch, on his arrival a few days earlier, would be expected to prostrate himself and kiss the pontiff's foot. Old Joseph was the mildest and gentlest of men, but even for him this was too much. When he received John's warning message, he refused to come ashore until the demand was retracted. At last, Eugenius was obliged to yield. Had he not done so, it is doubtful whether the Council of Ferrara would have ever taken place. It's interesting, isn't it, to consider this, given that there's actually been a recent controversy about J.D. Vance and Leo XIV about this specific instance regarding the concession to a specific authority. Sorry for bringing in so many sort of modern examples. It just they come to me when reading. This was only the first of many painful problems of protocol and precedence to arise. Both emperor and pope were extremely sensitive on all matters affecting their dignity. The relative positions of their two thrones in the cathedral, for example, raised difficulties which at one moment seemed almost insuperable. Later, when the venue had been shifted to the papal palace, John was to assist on proceedings on horseback to his throne itself. When this proved impossible, he demanded that the whole should be broken through a wall in order that he should not be seen to be dismounting, and that he could be carried to the throne without his foot touching the ground. This was done, and the sessions were suspended till the work was completed. Just imagine, this is a man who basically leads a city-state in terms of his actual sort of political authority. It's remarkable. John Julius Norwich goes on in the various chapters before this to basically mention that the city of Constantinople itself is basically derelict. What little residents in the city left had been decimated by plague and desertions after all the various sieges that occurred. 3 sieges in the quarter of a century during the reign of John VIII. There's basically no means by which the emperor can raise any sort of revenue. And even within the context of the Blachernae Palace, the empress and the emperor are basically cramped to one small corner, which is ill-maintained, but still all of these ceremonies are, assiduously sort of maintained. So the empire itself is basically crumbling around. You have, all of these abandoned, derelict buildings. The only things basically standing are still the walls. And yet, despite all of this, you have the retention of the ceremony.
Just on this point, just for the sake of viewers who are not familiar with the city or the civilization in question, sort of, if we're talking about the scale of the city here, just to put in the imagination, but when Constantine found Byzantium, it would have been a city of, say, 30, 40, possibly 50,000 in the 3rd century. By the time that he dies, it doubles in population. And then by the time the actual Theodosian walls are constructed by, they were designed by, or they were commissioned by Theodosius, but actually completed under his son Arcadius. The city rose up to about 250,000, and at its height, which depends sort of where you put that marker, it could be around the time of Heraclius. There was another sort of population surge during the Macedonian dynasty. Constantinople's roughly a city of between 600,000 and potentially 750,000. But in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, being sort of ravaged by these sieges that AM has mentioned here, and also you got to consider this is also the aftermath of the Black Death. Constantinople has the emperors afterwards, after the Reconquest, have attempted to repopulate the city. But despite the fact that even under the Latin emperors, the population fell almost back to pre-sort of Constantinian levels. By the time we arrive at the 1400s and approach the era of the fall of the city, Constantinople barely has a population of 60,000. It could be as low as even 50. So it's almost like back to pre Nova Roma levels in a sort of strange twist.
Just a little bit bigger than modern day Fairbanks, Alaska, for context.
Exactly right.
In the context, Florence at that time was a rising city, but nevertheless had a similar population.
Yes.
It's also interesting to consider, just in terms of the relevance. What's the economic relevance of Constantinople? You can almost possibly say that Galata possibly has more significance commercially and economically than the actual city of Constantinople, which is basically nothing more than a stop-off from the maritime links between the Genoese and the Black Sea coming through to the Aegean.
Who are the holders of the Galata district at this point? Let's not forget.
Yes,
the
exactly.
Genoese. Yes.
So it's not just a matter of the emperor isn't even fully in control of the city. As we saw during the period of the Komnenoi, where the Komnenoi made the very wise decision to outsource the construction of their navy to the Venetians, which of course went very well for them. So much of international trade is still dominated, affected by the lingering legacy of the Fourth Crusade. Such extraordinary punctilio may seem excessive, even ridiculous. To some extent, it was part of the elaborate protocol which had always existed in the Byzantine court. But in Ferrara, and later in Florence, it also had a deliberate purpose. If John's mission to the west was to succeed, it was essential that he should be seen not as a supplicant, but as the monarch of a great, if not the only, Christian empire. emphasis on only because, of course, the Byzantine emperors would never recognize the legitimacy of the papal coronated emperors.
Indeed.
Vital in the whole polity of Christendom, which must be preserved at all costs from the cupidity of the Turk. And again, that fact in itself is something that the Turks use to denigrate the whole notion of the Holy Roman Empire when they claim from Mehmet II to be the true successors. The patriarchal official Sylvester, from whose invaluable, if somewhat tendacious behind-the-scenes record of the council the above anecdotes have been taken, also records a remark made by the emperor to the patriarch before their departure from Constantinople about the appearance of the Greek ecclesiastics. If the church makes a dignified showing, it will be honored by them, and will be a credit to us. But if it is seen to be dirty and unkempt, it will be despised by them and count for nothing. And again, I think in terms of the legacy of this has succeeded because, I mean, if you go to the Magi Chapel in Florence, this has basically been recorded in some of the great Florentine frescoes of the early 15th century for all posterity, to the point that it was seen that the legacy of John VIII has inherited that inflated prestige as a result of this grand procession. But as Marcus alluded to, in terms of the fall and grace of the capital to a tenth of its you can say supported population within the Theodosian walls, again, it is something which is intensely political. It doesn't really have any terms of bearing of the reality of the situation of the Byzantine Empire at that time. Quite apart from the vexatious questions of etiquette, the council got off to a bad start. John had stipulated for months that for 4 months should elapse before the formal discussions on doctrine were to begin. One of his principal reasons for attending was to seek help from other European princes, and he was determined that no important decisions should be taken before their arrival. But spring turned to summer, and no princes appeared. The Latins grew more and more impatient. The Pope was responsible for the board and lodging of the entire Greek delegation, more and more concerned as his financial reserves fell ever lower. In June and July, to give themselves something to do, limited numbers of Greeks and Latins opened discussions on the questions of purgatory, which were doubtless where many of them felt themselves to be, but they reached no conclusions. Again, this emphasis on waiting for the other European princes, the idea that the emperor doesn't want to have to make all of these concessions and then deliberate with all of these European princes. Again, it's this basic idea. I'm going to make all of these concessions. I'm going to parley with all of these princes, and essentially, even if the negotiations, the church council meetings, go terribly wrong and nothing is basically achieved, then you can say there is a greater purpose almost, which is solved, which is that there's a contraction of alliances between these various princes, and that the emperor doesn't want to be seen to be giving away authority to Latin Christendom as a whole during the council stages before these alliances are effectively contracted. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Hello?
Sorry, yes, I would agree that that's a fair assessment. Sorry, my bad.
With August came the plague. Strangely enough, the Greeks appeared immune. The emperor was in any case away from Ferrara for most of the time, indulging in his favourite sport of hunting. But there was a heavy mortality among the Latin delegates, and in the city as a whole. Meanwhile, the Latins grew ever more irritated with their guests. Fortunately for them, however, the Greeks too were losing patience. They had been away from their home for the best part of a year at a time of great anxiety and uncertainty, and had so far achieved nothing. Many of them too were short of money, for the papal subsidies were becoming increasingly irregular. Finally, it was by now plain that none of the European princes had any intention of attending the council at all, so there was no point in waiting for them any longer. It was to everyone's relief when deliberations began in earnest on the 8th of October. For the first time, for the first 3 months, they were concerned almost exclusively with the filioque clause, and not even the question of whether the Holy Ghost did in fact proceed from the Father and the Son, rather than from the Father exclusively, so much as that of whether the act of introducing into the Nicene Creed was legitimate or not. So this isn't simply a matter of theology, this is more of a matter of historical record. The principal spokesman on the Greek side was the Metropolitan Mark Eugenicus, the one who famously resisted the council, who rested his case on a specific regulation agreed in 451 during the Council of Ephesus. To no one is allowed to recite, write, or compose a faith other than that defined by the Holy Fathers in Nicaea. The Latins argued that this disputed word was a clarification rather than an addition, and pointed out that the creed was recited in the Greek church already incorporated various changes from the Nicene original. It's interesting again that this is 451. Did I say 431? 451. That this is taking place near the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. But the Metropolitan would have none of it. It was anyway suggested a profoundly insignificant point. In that case, he testily replied, why were they so determined to keep it in? The issue was further clouded by linguistic problems. Few of the delegates spoke any language other than their own, and there were no qualified interpreters. Additional difficulties arose when it was discovered, at a fairly early stage in the proceedings, that various Latin and Greek words, at first believed to be precise equivalents, were in fact nothing of the sort. To take one example, the Greek word ousia, meaning substance, carried with it various shades of meaning quite alien from the Latin substantia. The sessions ended on the 13th of December with arguments as far away as ever. At this point, the Pope managed to persuade the delegates to move to Florence. He gave as his reason the continued presence of the plague in Ferrara, but his true motives were almost certainly financial. The council had been sitting for 8 months, showed every sign of going on indefinitely, and had always made alarming inroads on papal treasury. In Florence, on the other hand, the Medici could be trusted to help out, but the move also proved beneficial in other ways. When the sessions resumed towards the end of February, the Greeks, tired, anxious, and homesick, hungry, seemed distinctly readier to compromise than they had been in the previous year. By the end of March, they had agreed that the Latin formula, according to which the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, meant the same as the recently accepted Greek formula, whereby it proceeded from the Father through the Son. It was soon after this breakthrough that Patriarch Joseph finally expired, but then, as an observer rather unkindly remarked after muddling his prepositions, what else could he decently do? And that's a rather sort of horrific way of sort of interpreting it. With the filioque at last out of the way, sorry, Mr. P.
Oh no, I was just chortling at your your comment there.
I mean, just obviously you started this conversation regarding the Orthodox conception of the filioque. What do you think of the compromise of from the Father through the Son?
So from the Father through the Son, again, I'm not. I guess that's sort of different in kind from the Father and the Son. So, let me just reiterate. So, I remembered the creed while you were talking. So, and I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the Giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. And then in the filioque, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the Giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, the Catholic contention to this day is that these mean the same thing, just with clarification. And you could say that you could have a position like, from the Father through the Son, I guess. But I'm not actually sure if that is the dogmatic Orthodox position, actually. So I'd have to hear a little more back and forth on whether that or not that is indeed the sort of dogmatic Orthodox position. Because to my knowledge, I do not believe that it is.
Well, this wouldn't be. This was the conclusion of the council, which was repudiated some 50 years later.
Right. So
this was a Greek compromise.
By definition, no. Then
with the filioque at last out of the way, the other outstanding questions were quickly settled. The Greeks disapproved of the Roman dogma of purgatory, for which they could find no justification, and of the use of the unleavened bread at the sacrament, which they thought not only smacked of Judaism, but was disrespectful of the Holy Ghost. Symbolized by the leaven, they also deplored the Latin practice of giving communion in both kinds to the laity, and of forbidding the marriage of secular priests. but on all of these issues, they put up only token opposition. When, on the other hand, the Latins violently attacked the recently defined Eastern Orthodox doctrine concerning the uncreated energies of God, they declined to press the point. That's a point I actually want to bring up when I talk about Bessarion. The question of papal supremacy might at other times have caused difficulties, but since the Council of Basel, this had been a delicate subject and was constantly glossed over as far as possible. Indeed, this is something which is glossed over until, gosh, what is it? The Lateran Council during the pontificate of Leo X. So this is just before the Reformation, which basically renounces the conciliarist position and upholds the dogma of papal supremacy. So for the Pope again to try and force that issue just within the context of dealing with other Catholic clergymen, let alone dealing with the emperor, was almost impossible during that point. You needed the reascendancy of the Renaissance. Yes, someone has already preempted what we're going to talk about, Palomism, in the chat. You need the reascendancy of the greater Renaissance popes going from Nicholas V to Julius II, really to, you can say, counteract the proliferation of the doctrine of the ecumenical council taking preeminence. So like I said, this situation where the papacy is in itself a weak position, not we're talking from a theological point of view, we're just talking in terms of the reality of the church having just survived the Western Schism and having been reunified, that you can be some sort of bizarre closure without having to actually really address these points in any substantive way, as we've talked about with these word games regarding Greek mechanisms to be inserted to gloss over the fact of the filioque, which, as Mr. Patriarch has basically referenced, is effectively ignored afterwards. Thanks largely to the emperor himself, who employed persuasion and threats in equal measure to ensure the amenability of his subjects. By midsummer, agreement had been reached on every major issue, and on Sunday, the 5th of July, the official decree of union, little more than a statement of the Latin position apart from one or two concessions permitting Greek usages, was signed by all the Orthodox bishops, except the Metropolitan of Ephesus, who had given in on absolutely nothing, but was forbidden by John to exercise a veto, again giving the whole notion of the specific right of the emperor basically to, quote unquote, defend the Orthodox position and defend against heresies. So basically has a right, again, significant considering the actual weak position of the emperor over the voices of his own clergy regarding this time. But of course, we'll see effectively how strong the emperor's position is when it comes to the effects of this over the next 10 years. The Latins then added their own signatures, and on the following day, the decree was publicly proclaimed in Florence Cathedral, being recited first in Latin by Cardinal Cesarini, and then in Greek by the Metropolitan Bessarion. The Latin version began with the words "Latento Caeli," let the heavens rejoice. But the heavens, as it soon became clear, had precious little reason to do so. So, I mean, I could go on with the sort of the reading regarding this, but it's interesting to consider, you know, what the immediate effects are. I already alluded to at the beginning of the stream where I mentioned the historical account from Ducas, who basically comes back and the prelates of the Orthodox Church basically can see that, you know, we have effectively given up our religion. You know, that's what this ultimately amounts to. But there's a very interesting case bringing back the whole Russian example, you know, which we're going to sort of lean on more, which is there's already been reference to Isidore of Kiev, made Bishop of Kiev, and by extension has primacy over all of the religious clerics, over all of the Rus. He holds that authority basically thanks to the authority vested by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. He goes to Moscow in 1441, so he travels from Rome to Moscow in the aftermath of the council. He reads the name of the Pope, Pope Eugene, in the Dormition Cathedral at the heart of the Kremlin in Moscow. And again, I talk about reading the name of the Pope in all the liturgies of the Catholic Church. And afterwards, what does the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily II, do? Call him a wicked wolf and lock him up in a monastery. and declare that he is basically a heretic, and all of the Russian bishops basically follow suit. And 7 years later, in 1448, we have the autocephaly of the Muscovite Russian Church from Constantinople. But it's interesting to consider, I mean, what else is going on. I mean, the situation, one easy way of reading the Russian situation, the Russian response to this, is basically to say, oh, well, obviously because the Russians are truest to the spirit of the original Orthodox position, that they will, of course, recognize this, false priest in the form of Isidore of Kiev. And we will deal with him promptly. I don't believe that's the case entirely. I think that's a rather sort of superficial way of reading it. Rather, Vasily II was in an incredibly weak position politically. He basically spent the entirety of his reign facing off threats from his brothers. The idea of primogeniture wasn't really established until the reign of his son, Ivan III, in I think it's the same year as Constantinople fell, 1453. He had actually been blinded by one of his brothers in one of these civil wars. And of course, Marcus, as you know, blinding was a traditional, you can almost say a symbolic punishment invited on the enemies of the Byzantines and on various emperors. And of course, with the idea that once you've been blinded, you can no longer rule. But of course,
blinding and nose cutting were used for that sort of purpose, broadly speaking.
What was the official name of Justinian II? Rhinocephalus.
Rhinocephalus, yeah.
Yes,
the noseless, yeah.
The noseless, exactly for that reason. He lost the empire and then came back. These are all sort of significant in terms of looking at this point, because I think it's fair to say that had Vasily II not had to deal with these political problems, he wouldn't have been so willing to treat the Metropolitan of all the Rus in the way that he had. Rather, you have this political problem. All of your bishops are basically against the council. They don't have the same reason to be so desperate for Rome's help, because Moscow is not in the position where it's about to basically be conquered by Muslim Tartars that it was a century before. So Moscow has independence, which it can assert vis-a-vis Rome, which in the way that the Byzantine Empire at this time cannot. So rather, having this this Eastern Catholic priest coming over just invites all sorts of problems. And so the best way to deal with it is basically to pretend the issue does not exist. And that's basically the response of Vasily II. There isn't this great claim that, the Third Rome now exists within Moscow immediately. This is a process that takes decades in order to come to some sort of a sound sort of theological reading under Metropolitan Zosimus during the reign of Vasily III. I think the creative solution the Muscovites have is that we don't want this man to come in and to change all the religious norms during a period of civil war within Moscow, but we don't want to go so far as to actually do anything regarding breaching with the church. So effectively, the argument goes that he is allowed to escape by Vasily II after spending some 7 months under house arrest in a monastery, and then he is allowed to keep his title. So he is still technically the head of the Russian church, but everyone pretends as if he doesn't exist. So we don't have to deal with the issue of having some sort of definite opposition to him. And it's only after 7 years of this, you can say, priestly abeyance, that finally the situation in Moscow is so desperate that they decide to elect a priest almost simply for the sake of, we need a religious head in Moscow. We can't deal with this situation anymore, where we have a heretic as our priest, but we pretend not to acknowledge him. So essentially, those are the conditions which,
you can't ignore it anymore, for sure. But yeah, I think that's a very good point you bring up about Vasily's internal political situation. Sorry if I seem a bit distracted. I'm holding a baby here, trying not to get him to wake up. But the issue, I mean, when you're in a situation where you are dealing with, interpalace intrigues and rebellions and stuff, the last thing you want to do, practically speaking, is turn your whole belief system and ecclesiastical structure on its head, right? And not only that, although the most of the bishops of the Council of Florence did sign on to it, with the notable exception of Saint Mark of Ephesus, the laity, good chunk of the priesthood, and I think pretty much most of the monastics basically outright opposed the decision of the hierarchs. So, although, so Vasily, I'm talking from a practical standpoint here, he could pretty easily sort of highlight the fact that this decision was not even really met with popular approval by the spiritual fathers of the monastic orders.
I mean, in specific reference, I think Vasily II got an official approval from the priest at Mount Athos regarding his position. So it wasn't just a Russian phenomenon; it was a Orthodox phenomenon.
It was. So he could sort of to sort of back up. So he had these political exigencies he had to deal with. I don't want to have this, heretical hierarch, and then now we're going with Rome now, boys. We're all uniates now. But he could also again highlight this issue. I'm sorry, the baby here is distracting me. He could lean on the religious prestige of Mount Athos, the monastics, and the faithful laity, and a big chunk of the priesthood, to sort of legitimize his position that actually it's the hierarchs who've sort of renounced the true faith, and we're the ones protecting it.
Just to illustrate your point, because there is something similar that happens in Russia later in its history, and it's during, surely you're probably much more aware of this than I am, Mr. P, which is the Nikon reforms during the reign of Emperor Alexius. And
yes.
And the reason I bring that up is that it's similar in the sense that you have a very powerful religious leader who is essentially leading a top-down revolution that causes an internal schism between the old believers and the canonical Orthodox Church. And again, it's in the spirit of returning essentially to Greece in terms of the Nikon reforms, as opposed to these innovations that we see in the Russian Church, such as the sign of the cross and the three fingers. And the reason I bring that up is that Alexius basically permitted this religious revolution when his authority was far stronger as Tsar of all the Russias in the 1650s compared to the position of Vasily II in the 1440s. And again, the difference is also Vasily II did not believe in the union, whereas Alexius clearly believed in the reforms of Nikon. So, like I said, if you're going to issue a religious top-down reformation like Henry VIII, like Tsar Alexis, you need to have that political will supporting it. And it just seemed like in the case of Russia, it was absolutely disastrous. It simply did not exist at that time. But coming back to the Greek example, which is significant because there is this period where we see with Gennadius Scholaris in particular being the most prominent of the turncoats from this faction of having supported the union and then having basically rejected the union. John VIII and later Constantine XI, who had de facto actually controlled Constantinople and also the Despotatum at various points in the emperor's absence, are in this position of, okay, we have this union. This union is effective beyond these theological points in terms of being able to bring allies from the West over. But we also have this problem that the opposition from the lower clergy and some of the higher clergy is so extreme that it will actually be such a hindrance that it might as well not matter that we have the support from the Westerners from Occidental Christendom, because we have to deal with all of these problems brought about as a result of the union, i.e., regular people rising up against the authority of the emperor. You can say it's in part thanks to the legacy of the emperor's position as the defender of Orthodox Christendom and that association between the religious and the political in the empire, which actually allows this to happen at all. It's interesting to see how, say, for example, someone like Vasily II, who is not the emperor of Eastern Rome, is not the Emperor of Constantinople, could have directed that sort of energy or authority on his own volition, because ultimately he's nothing more than a minor prince ruling over a vast territory, effectively. His prestige hasn't become that of the Tsar of the Russias that we have much later on. So that's interesting to consider. But in terms of looking at, obviously, why the union was not received enthusiastically, we have to look at the material results of how this manifests in terms of the counter-conquest against the Ottomans. We've already had the Crusade of Nicopolis during 1395, some 50 years before. That goes disastrously. The only respite, ironically, for the Byzantine Empire during this time doesn't come from the Christians, it comes from Tamerlane. When Tamerlane is able to defeat the Ottomans in kind decisively at the Battle of Ankara, and leads to a 2 decades long series of civil wars among the Ottoman Empire, but against all odds, seemingly, they're able to reconsolidate around the figure of Murad. And so the Poles, the Hungarians, the Christians, they unite in the Crusade of Varna. And you can almost say, Mr. Patriarch, this is kind of like Pelennor Fields without a eucatastrophe. This should have been the Tolkien-esque eucatastrophe. If Isildur of Kiev is basically Gandalf, he's going around trying to rally all these figures and unite unite all of these princes. We have the Council of Elrond, which is the Council of Florence. We have all the dwarves, attacking the elves and things like that. But we all agree, we all agree to come to Pelennor Fields, but we all get massacred in the process. I know I'm being very flippant, but effectively that is what happens, unfortunately. The Varna should have culminated in this, but ultimately it's one of the most tragic anticlimaxes in terms of this moment of Christian solidarity in the history of Europe until that point. Do you think I'm exaggerating?
No, I like your your Battle of Pelennor Fields analogy. Yeah, I mean, what might have been, it's one of these historical turning points that, if things had gone a different way, I mean, the world might look quite a bit different. It's sort of like the inverse of Charles Martel, right? Like if he had failed, like what would Europe look like?
I mean, there are revisionists out there who will basically say that the Battle of Poitiers was almost like the Battle of Lepanto. It had more propaganda significance than it did in terms of the actual sort of course of the conflict, because the Battle of Poitiers was more of a raid. You can almost say in terms of the actual sort of seismic significance of the parties arrayed against the Ottomans, it was more significant because it wasn't just a coalition of all of these forces, but the king of both Poland and Hungary contributed to the battle and was slain as a result of this. So it wasn't just a calamity in that sense. Yeah. It was, talk about my Lord of the Rings comparison again. Theoden has been killed, but we lost the battle anyway. So
Theoden and Aragon. Yeah.
Yes, everyone is dead, and in a few years, John VIII will also be dead, and will be left to his middle-aged, childless brother Constantine to try and wrestle with this legacy and try to hold on to what is left. And something that is important to consider is that historically, the Emperor of Constantinople was officiated over by two bodies, the Senate and once again we have you could basically say the Byzantine consecration of the empire, the church. So there is the induction by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then there is the acclamation by the Senate, which makes the emperor. This more so, say, for example, than what we see with the original Roman Empire, which is just the acclamation by the Senate ought to be sufficient. And in some cases with the barracks emperors, we don't even have that. But what is significant about Constantine the 11th? Again, he's this almost Barbarossa-esque figure in terms of the imagination of the Greeks, because he is the last emperor who held back against the Turks. But he has to deal with the legacy of the Union of the Churches. He has to deal with the fact that what should have amounted to the great deliverance of the empire, with the liberation of the Balkans as a result of the Crusade of Varna, had failed 6 years before he comes to the throne. And indeed, it is during that time that the last, I mean, I'm not sure whether you're sort of more informed, but it's basically assumed that there was no patriarch during most of the reign of Constantine, because Patriarch Gregory III, had fled the city, being a uniate, and he flees to Rome. So there isn't this patriarchal confirmation. And indeed, interestingly enough, who is the prelate who offers Constantine communion just before he goes off and basically, dies fighting against the forces of Mehmed II? It's none other than Isidore of Kiev, which is why I bring up again my tenuous Gandalf comparison. He's just been exiled from Moscow. He comes back to Rome and then tries to bolster the success of the union between Rome and the Orthodox, and it's the presence of Eastern Rite and Latin Rite priests in the Hagia Sophia before Constantine goes over. So Constantine again is wedded to this association of the legacy of the union of the churches. Like I said, it is with the blessing of the Catholic, soon to be ecumenical patriarch, the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, which he becomes in the year 1458, that he goes off and basically dies fighting against Mehmed II. I think I want to ask this of you, Marcus, because I and Mr. B have been talking more often, but what do you think that has in terms of the implication of Greek history going forward, that immediately after Constantine's death, we have Gennadius Scholaris basically pouring scorn on the legacy of the union of the churches and basically willing to coalesce a new Greek-Roman identity around the Miletorum based on the repudiation of the union, which again is formally repudiated some sort of 30 years later. But it's the fact that the last Greek Byzantine emperor fights and does so in the context of being part of the union of the churches, but is also associated with this idea of Greek Orthodox nationality. And yet he also represents this heathen tendency that's been associated with him. How can you reconcile all of these conflicting ideas?
Well, not easily, but if I can just perhaps present a couple of things and then we can maybe elaborate on some points. I do tend to follow the judgment, well, not entirely, but at least to a point, understand what's being said when you have people such as Edward Luttwak, for instance, who sort of says that from 1204 onwards and the fragmentation of the Byzantine world, you no longer have the actual empire as such. What you have is a number of successor kingdoms, and then when even the city's retaken under the reign of Michael VIII, you still have, in essence, a rump kingdom. The idea of 1204. Thanks, Second Horizon. It's still early here. You sort of have just a rump kingdom, and also the idea of, and we've used this terminology in our actual stream dedicated to the subject on Byzantine history, that the idea of this sort of commonwealth, as it were, this sort of Orthodox sort of Roman commonwealth tends to dissipate, and what you sort of have is a more of an orientation towards Hellenism specifically. There's this consolidation of an idea of, rather than being a Roman nation or Romeoi, and being a nation that sort of incorporates Isaurians, Armenians, Slavs, Amoranians, etc., Vlachs. It's more, there's this sort of more inward-looking sort of orientation towards a specific Greek identity. That becomes far more apparent after 1204, and certainly in the sort of 14th and 15th century going forward. The other thing being that I'm trying to think of the other point I want to raise, that in terms of Gennadios Scholarios specifically, is that I think his quotation regarding, because let's not forget, he was one of the leading voices which dissented against the Council of Florence and the Union. And I'm just trying to think of, there's actually a quotation of his. I'm just trying to find it here because I don't want to mince my words or butcher it. But he basically, in the years leading up to the fall of the city, he does write this. I hate to call it a screed. It's not a screed, but it's more of an appeal to the identity of this sort of decaying, dying state, and in sort of in what could be described as an open letter to the citizens of the city and to the the remnants of the empire. Scholarios writes, "O unhappy Romans, why have you forsaken the truth? Why do you not trust in God instead of," well, in this source it says the Italians, but I think the Greeks use the word, or he uses the sort of more the Greek phrase Franks, or because these words are interchangeable often in the Greek lexicon.
Well, just to reference, I mean, Latin is perhaps a more, from that time, perhaps more politically correct, but Frank in particular has pejorative connotations associated with the barbarian ascent of Charlemagne.
Correct.
That basically is the association. So Latinocratia is, you could say, a more neutral reference rather than the Francocratia or the return of the Franks. Of course, these terms are ubiquitous during the Crusades. But like we see that the etymology of barbarism is Greek. It means foreigner. You can say barbarism is intimately associated with the idea of being a Frank, in addition to being a heretic.
So to sort of go on from this, I'll just start from the top again. Sorry. "Oh, unhappy Romans, why have you forsaken the truth? Why do you not trust in God instead of in the Italians or Franks, either which way? In losing your faith in what you believe in your forefathers' inheritance, you will lose the city, and you'll embrace a captivity which will soon befall us." Something to that effect, because it's quoted differently by different people. And so I think it can be sort of said that he was an opponent of this prior to its occurrence. And with the fall of the city, he essentially is the leading clergyman that remains in Constantinople. And so given that he is sort of tapped on the shoulder by Mehmed to then lead the millet, which would come to govern the Orthodox and the Greeks of the empire, he was sort of in a unique position whereby he sort of still had ecclesiastical authority, indeed ecclesiastical supremacy regarding the Orthodox that would then live under the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultanate. He could use his position to amplify what would already been his misgivings regarding the Act of Union. That's how I would see it personally.
Well, I mean, his authority was always contentious because, like I said, Gregory III, was absent in the same way that Isidore of Kiev was also absent. So the authority had to come. It was almost a tacit acceptance of the idea that Mehmed II was the legitimate successor of the emperor, in the form that you accept his authority, even though, again, he's a heathen. So it's this horrific contradiction that someone like Gennadius Scalaris basically has to exist under in order to sustain the presence of an Orthodox community. But as you mentioned, there come advantages from that, which is the advantage to basically confirm the break from Rome. What was the break from, what was the union with Rome basically supposed to achieve? It was supposed to achieve victory against the Turks. Well, the Turks have now won. So
Or at the very least, survival in the face of them, yes.
Yes. So basically, those arguments have fallen to the wayside. And again, this is what is so ubiquitous with the argument of Zosimus. Basically, you can say the chronicler behind the idea of the Third Rome, and Moscow as having the mantle of the succession after Constantinople fell to the Muslims. It wasn't directed so much against the Muslims, it was directed against the Uniates. It was directed against the Catholics. The idea that it was, again, you mentioned this idea with Gennadius, but this direct association with the forsaking of the true faith leading to defeat, i.e., this was not some inevitable result of the encroachments of the Ottomans after centuries, but rather this was an explicit divine retribution as a result of the union. So quite the opposite. You didn't lose simply because the Catholic support was ineffective ultimately after between 1439 and 1453. Rather, it was the explicit repudiation of true orthodoxy, of your political orthodoxy, which allowed the existence of the state affairs to come to be. So in that sense, you have the one argument, which is, you can almost say, the retroactive nationalist argument, very much present in, say, for example, the 19th century. Those who wanted to make King Constantine of Greece King Constantine the 12th in order to acknowledge some sort of succession between these ideas. So this is much later. But this idea with the martyr king, who goes off fighting to defend this great Christian empire on the fringes, which had been the bulwark of Christianity since the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. And then the counter argument to that this was some, apostate effectively from the church, and that this was a divine punishment, and Mehmed II was simply the culmination of that, and now it is up to other figures within the Orthodox Commonwealth to assume that role of the defense of Christendom, and that is manifested in the idea of the Third Rome. Again, I mentioned the idea of the Union of Brest and the Eastern Church liturgies, and I would say this: there's an aspect of restlessness, and which you can say prefigures a lot of, you can say that the whole nature of the union between the Eastern liturgies and the Roman Catholics, you even have to distinguish, are you a Roman Catholic? No, I'm simply a Catholic because I follow by the Eastern Rite. And I bring that up because you come to a figure like what we mentioned earlier, Sophia Paleologos. She was the daughter of Prince Thomas. Prince Thomas was the brother of Emperor Constantine XI. He ruled over the Despotate of Morea, and he did so after the fall of Constantinople for nearly another decade. What's significant about the Morea, it basically acted as this last element of Romanitas, Greek Romanitas, within the whole construct of, the greater sort of Hellenic remit. We're talking about Anatolia and Greece. It's the same with the Empire of Trebizond. Both of these regions, the Despotate of Morea and the Empire of Trebizond, fall in the 1460s. But nevertheless, the Paleologoi in Morea have become Catholic, and the children of Thomas go over and they live in Rome. And one of these children, daughter, is Sophia Paleologos. So you can say that, within it's the same way that the princes of Montferrat were also members of the Paleologos family. It's this irony that you have the last great dynasty of the Eastern Roman Empire are Catholic now for all intents and purposes. So they have this immense dynastic and cultural cachet. And effectively, how can we use this? Because the Pope, of course, now has all of these Greeks in Constantinople, including Bessarion, which I really want to talk about at the end of this conversation, just after this little segment. But we also have these Catholic Greek princesses. And so we come up with this idea of, okay, well, let us arrange for Sophia to become the Grand Princess of Muscovy. We've already tried this with Isidore of Kiev. That went disastrously in 1441. But perhaps through marriage, through the association with the imperial dynasty, the Prince of Muscovy can be brought to the light of Catholicism. And indeed, despite the fall of Constantinople itself, you can say that it would act as some form of commiseration for Christendom if, despite that, the unity could be achieved by bringing over the last great Orthodox prince over to become a Catholic. But what does she do when, after years of negotiations and intense planning, she goes over, she effectively renounces her faith, and she goes along with the Third Rome idea. She goes along with this idea of this explicit association with the Paleologos being Orthodox, not being Catholic, of this demonization of the church union period, and of pioneering, the theories of Zosimus. You can say that it's not just a theological argument which is brought to bear against the union, but against this dynastic claim which Sophia basically imbues the Danilevich-Rurikid dynasty and later the claims of Ivan IV. Their legacy effectively is associated with a sanitized, a cleansed version of the Paleologos dynasty, which doesn't have this association with the union of churches. I find it remarkable because there was actually this pattern I was reading about recently with the Orthodox converts to the New World as a result of immigration in the late 19th century, which is that you have all of these immigrants from Russia, you have all of these immigrants from Poland, from Austria-Hungary, which has a huge number of Uniate Catholics in the late 19th century, from parts of Hungary and the Kingdom of Galicia-Lodomeria. They go over to America. And without the official sanction and the structures of the church, they basically all convert. There were mass conversions in Argentina and America. This isn't just a USA specified phenomenon, but they basically all decide to convert to Orthodoxy, as this basically is a return to the true church, effectively. So this isn't just a series of isolated examples, but it's repeated again and again, and up until this day. But I find it interesting that there is such an explicit case in the form of Sevilla, which has such detrimental effects to the whole basis of Catholic policy towards Russia.
Yeah, no, and to sort of highlight your point, one of the Orthodox saints of the New World was a man named Saint Alexei of Wilkes-Barre, who, you're like, Saint Alexei of Wilkes-Barre, like in America? That's correct. And he was an Orthodox, born into Carpatho-Russian family. And he was responsible for bringing over hundreds of thousands of Uniate Eastern Catholics back to, Orthodox Christianity, and very successful. And I think the fact that he was so successful, I mean, part of that, you could say is miraculous, but also there's this historical precedent you mention with the Paleologos princess as sort of a kind of a type of this person, where they were able to revert back to Orthodoxy relatively easily.
And the reason I bring this up is that I mean, it would seem on the surface that there is, unfortunately, a certain artificiality, i.e., there has to be a vast sort of series of contextual elements which have to confirm someone within this particularism of the Catholic Church, which is the Eastern Rite. I mean, as Marcus and I alluded to at the beginning, the whole idea of the Union of Brest and Poland, Lithuania being a microcosm of what the Roman Empire was during the reign of Theodosius, i.e., so long as the secular authority is there maintaining the unity of the church, then something like the existence of the Uniate may seem possible. And it would seem that, again, taking those things away, it would seem to discredit the argument of the Uniate faction even more, which is why I think it's so important to act as a counter to that we talk about Bessarion. I also wanted to talk about Isidore of Kiev, but for the sake of, because this stream will probably last up until 3 hours, for the sake of brevity, I had to focus on one of these figures, either Bessarion or Cardinal Isidore. For people who want to read more about Isidore, because I've already mentioned many very, very interesting things about him in the stream, there was actually a book in English published about him recently, Cardinal Isidore, a late Byzantine scholar and warlord. by A.G. Keller, if you want to buy that. It's an academic book, so it's quite expensive, but nevertheless it's interesting to read. Instead here, I have an article by Professor Joseph Gill on the sincerity of Bessarion the Unionist, and you can find the link in the description. Latin Catholics, both then and now, have doubted the sincerity of Bessarion's adherence to the Union, and again, that's what I've just been referencing with the converts of the New World and Sophia Paleologos. With Eastern Christians, it is different. In the 15th century, the Union was immediately challenged in the East, and a number of those who in 1439 had accepted it in Florence rejected it a short time afterwards in Constantinople. Obviously, they could not look on Unionists with a favourable eye. To defend their own double action, they had to plead duress. To explain away the defection of others, they alleged venality and ambition. Bessarion, when he was on the high seas returning to the East, was created a cardinal. It was doubtless a reward for his part in promoting the union of the churches. But the Greek anti-unionists of his day concluded from that the prospect of reward had been constant and the chief motive of his unionism, and he had, indeed, been a willing tool in the hands of the Pope. That he might have been sincere in his actions, innocent of ambition, and unaware of the Pope's intentions was discounted. That in naming two Greeks, the obvious choice being Bessarion and Isidore, among 17 new cardinals, Eugene IV might have wanted to bring into relief the new union of the churches was not taken into consideration. Yet both of these explanations might be true, and if one assesses the characters of both Eugenius and Bessarion from the general tenor of their lives, they almost certainly are true. The Greek world of today judges Bessarion with divergent voices. Some condemn him outright. In 1968, the holder of the chair of Byzantine history in the University of Athens, Professor Tomadakis, in a paper read in Venice, professed to show that all those among the Greeks in the 15th century who favoured union with the Latins were humanists, and that all humanists were free thinkers. Plethon was a real unbeliever, and his pupil Bessarion, dressed in the habit of the Greek clergy, was a humanist, and at bottom was no more a believer than his master. This is a point I referenced very early on, that unfortunately, you could almost say Bessarion, I wouldn't say it's fair to say he's a Greek Erasmus, because Erasmus was fundamentally a different figure. I mean, Erasmus is what you have if you basically take Plethon and Voltaire and combine them together in terms of him being a satirist. But the point is, you have a great neoclassical scholar, a great Platonist, and as a result of that, you use it as a means, basically, especially from a more sort of conservative point of view within the church. Humanism in the 15th century, Renaissance humanism, is basically considered by some to be a byword for neo-paganism, general disbelief in the church, and also leading to the creation of the conditions for the schism, which is the Protestant Reformation from 1517 onwards. So it would seem very obvious if you draw these certain connections and thereby conclude, oh, this is simply the representative of a type, and we need to disassociate any sort of true sincerity or belief from a certain type. Do you think that's fair to say?
I'd say so. Yeah.
He was great as a politician, admittedly, and ecclesiastical certainly, but not a true believer. Bessarion is a humanist in the scene that, faced with a choice between faith and learning, he chose the philosophy of the Greeks. And that again is why, when we talk about the Renaissance having injected new sort of intellectual fervor as a result of the Council of Florence, that is the legacy of the Council of Florence. It isn't the union of the churches that we speak of. It is instead, an added layer to the intellectual firmament of the Renaissance. But all of this again would be confirmed that the union of the churches is even more of a novelty within that whole context. A few years earlier, Tomadakis had written, elected cardinal after having placed in his high political abilities at the service of the See of Rome, he did not rank his religious faith above political aims and ambitions. I must say, I don't know why, if we're talking about the Renaissance clergy or Orthodox clergy or Catholic clergy, we would need to single out a single man as being typical of those sort of ambitions. But nevertheless, there we are. Other Greeks, perhaps most, have a sympathy for Bessarion as a man of great learning who put patriotism above religious conscience. The Archimandrite Parthenius, in the beginning of his brochure on Bessarion, writes, He is the symbol of a patriot who, for the sake of his country, denies everything, even his very faith. And by that, of course, denies his faith for the sake of being able to basically bring allies into the camp against the Ottomans. Towards the end, he asks, will he remain forever the great patriot and the great renegade? I'm afraid so, because I could not find anything to justify his change. One of the latest appreciations of Bessarion from an Orthodox pen is the article of one C.J. Petrinis in the New Greek Ecclesiastical Encyclopedia. In his view, Bessarion was aware of the dangers overhanging Byzantium and proffered counsel to the royal despots, indicating as the only way of salvation the orientation of the policy of the empire towards the west. In Italy, little by little, he began to adopt conciliatory positions or to accept Roman Catholic opinions, or else he avoided committing himself. His conversation to the Roman Catholic Church had no small motive, but it was the price he believed should be paid when the issue was through the alliance with the West to save the political independence of the race, because Bessarion could not understand how it was possible for an enslaved people to preserve a free church. And even if his arguments were insincere, regarding the union of the church, that is still a valid point. Ultimately, yes, Gennadius Scholaris may have achieved his church free of the effects of the lingering elements of concessions towards Catholicism, but it was an enslaved church. And as we're all very aware, the idea that this was some sort of grand free association and they lived under the a hallowed state of Muslim tolerance through the next succeeding centuries, especially if you look in the context of the Greek War of Independence, is complete and utter nonsense. So that is an important point to consider. He had other motives besides these political ones. He seemed to be really persuaded that the expression met with in some Greek fathers through the Son was not far removed from the Latin filioque, and he had great admiration for Latin humanism. The upshot seems to be once more great patriot, great renegade. Great patriot he assuredly was. Great renegade for these writers implies at least subordinating theological and religious convictions to political ends. Is this conclusion justified and just? First, however, it will be helpful to consider Bessarion's background. In a century before his birth, the Greek Church had been divided over the theology of Palomism, to such a degree that the names of his opponents, Balaram and Akindanus, had been added to the list of heresiarchs anathematized on the Sunday of Orthodoxy. I like that term, heresiarchs. Of course, I'm familiar with it, but I haven't actually seen it written so often. But nevertheless, it's it's an interesting way to basically describe your religious opponents. Palomism, at least for a time, had been a touchstone of orthodoxy and a weapon against the Latinophrons, the Latinizers. But it was also the reason why some of those who had not been able to accept it had abandoned the Greek Church to join the Latin, among them people of theological merit and political position. Manuel Calicalis and the three brothers Chrysoburgus all became Dominicans. Demetrius, Caiodonus, and Manuel Chrysolaris and many others remained laymen. Their names are less important than what they symbolized. They were, in fact, a challenge to the Greek Church. They had rejected what the Church had solemnly proclaimed as true to seek truth elsewhere. Their example cannot have been lost on Greek thinkers of the day, theologians, philosophers, and inquirers. So this is an important consideration to note, which is the Palomism or Palomite theology. Gregory Palamas was writing in the early 14th century, so 100 years before we see the Council of Florence, and this is after the Great Schism of 1054. And from what I understand, we're talking about the concept of hesychasm, which is, and we're talking about other elements, you can say, of Orthodox mysticism. And I want to bring this up and really ask your thoughts on Palomism, because the argument basically follows is that what drove many people willingly into the arms of Latin Christianity, of Roman Catholicism, was the association with Palomism as basically representing theological innovations and heresies, as has been implied. To basically counter that, what would your overall opinion of Palomism be, Mr. Patriarch?
Sorry, I was on mute there for a little bit. So, from what I understand, the hesychasm has to do largely with monastic practice, solitude, and heavy recitation of the Jesus prayer. And that is kind of a monastic practice and a way of sort of achieving these other things which are core to Palomism, ideas of theosis, and also notably for differentiation between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, absolute divine simplicity, which is this idea you get in characters like Thomas Aquinas, versus the Palomite essence energies distinction. Now, to boil it down simply, because these are fairly complicated topics, but in
yes, I don't mean to put you so much on the spot.
Okay, it's no problem. But to boil it down simply, as far as I understand, Thomism is largely an extension of Aristotelian philosophy, and that the idea that you have one absolute divine simple essence, but God's actions and his essence are kind of indistinct in a certain sense. So, and this goes to the idea that God is pure actus purus, right? So there is no unrealized potentiality in God, which is the Thomistic position. The Palomite position, or the Orthodox position, is the essence energies distinction, and that yes, God is simple in his essence. There is no disunity in God's essence, in the same way that we can say the divine essence shared by God, the three persons of the Trinity, there's no distinction there. It's all the same divine essence. However, God's energies or his actions in the world are distinct from God's essence. So to the Palomite / Orthodox position, it would be a mistake to conflate the divine essence with God's actions in the world. So what this would mean is that, for example, there's I'm trying to think of the word, theophany, right? So theophany is an example of God's energies sort of manifesting in time and space. And by that extension, all of creation, human life, the planets, right, are basically theophanies. They are manifestations of God's energies. So God is willing them into being. However, the Lord can, because he is sovereign, decide when and where to manifest these energies, right? So they do have a divine source, but the energies of God are distinct from the personhood or divine essence of him. So we would not confuse a tree with God, even though the tree is a product of God manifesting his energies in time and space, right? So there is a root cause of the divine essence in all things, true, but the Palomite distinction is that the energies and essence of God are distinct. God, the divine essence, can exist without certain manifestations of his energies, but not the other way around. And because he can will different energies at different times, the doctrine of absolute divine simplicity, of the kind you might find in Aristotle or Thomistic thinking, is an error. So this becomes one of the big sticking points between St. Gregory of Palomas and the Catholic world. And sort of his famous interlocutor was this this guy named Barlaam, who was a monk, and they discussed, hesychasm and the ideas of like sort of the essence energies distinction versus the divine simplicity. But this has caused some degree of controversy even today in the Catholic world, because you have this interesting situation where a lot of because St. Gregory of Palamas predated the Council of Florence and the advent of the Uniates. You have this interesting problem where a fairly large amount of Uniate Catholics actually venerate St. Gregory of Palamas on the one hand, but on the other hand, the official Catholic Church teaching is that Palamas was a heretic. So it causes problems in terms of church unity, and I think sort of helps explain kind of what we were talking about earlier, where a lot of Uniates find it easy to sort of revert back to Orthodoxy, largely because I think of this Palamite influence.
It shouldn't be understated. I mean, there were a series of church councils held in Constantinople from the 1340s up until the 1360s, and they became so ubiquitous that they were known as the Palamite councils. And just to reference, we talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and there's being some sort of contrast against him. Thomas Aquinas was writing 100 years earlier. But maybe, again, I would need to go back and really understand the theological implications of someone like Gennadius Scholaris, but it seems ironic that Scholaris is coming to the council as a Thomist and basically wanting to use the arguments of Aquinas in order to bring about the union from an Orthodox point of view. And yet we're talking about Scholaris being the inaugurator, effectively, of this new age of the post-Union Church within the context of the Militarum within the Ottoman Empire. So, at one time it would seem that Thomism could explain figures away like Bessarion in opposition to this. Yet how can we have someone like Gennadius Scholaris? It's just interesting to consider. The root of our difficulty is the question of divine essence and operation, about which your reverence knows that in our church a variety of answers have been put forward, and it was stated and decreed that divine essence should be held to be distinct from its divine operation. St. Thomas Aquinas replies differently, and Bessarion wants answers to queries he proposes on Aquinas' arguments. The quotation continues, "But first, if you will let us consider with reverence how the body of Christians can be called the Catholic and Apostolic Church, which on the foremost article of faith has expressed itself contradictingly, and has patently determined that everyone should express it in the same way. How can such a church urge and direct in the name of the author of truth, when it has taught itself a falsehood about him? A contradiction cannot be true, such is the common opinion of all men. There was a time when our church used to say that there was nothing uncreated except only the divinity in the three persons. All its perfections were identical with that. Afterwards, and not very much later, persuaded by I do not know for what reasons, it decreed that opposite and imposed a belief as if it were a pillar of the faith, declaring not only the Trinity uncreated, but also a host of some other kind of divinities. Since it has fallen from the truth, it seems that it is not the church with which Christ promises to abide to the consummation of the world, for the abiding cannot be understood otherwise than as its being preserved by him, always on the foundation of truth. And again, since it once erred, now it is doubtful for us whether it abides in truth. I beg, most excellent Father, to hear from you on this subject something new and striking and replete with wisdom." There follows Andrew's long answer of philosophical commentary in defense of St. Thomas's teachings, which, on occasional quotation from the Fathers. Whether Bessarion was convinced by the reply cannot be said, but the tone of the query leaves little doubt. He already not only hesitated about the truth of Palomism, he had rejected it. His rejection brought doubts about the claims of the Church, which he had proved Palomism to be the true Church of Christ. If the Eastern Church was not the true church, the Western Church must be such, was the logic of those days. The letter of Andrew was answering had been dispatched by Bessarion from Methone, repeating his request made, but not answered some time before. So even before the Council of Florence, Bessarion already viewed the Latin Church with reverence and was inclined to think its claims to be closer to the truth more than the Greek Church. So again, it's this argument, how can one simply go into the whole context of the union of the churches and concede this for purely political reasons if you've already become so disillusioned with the church as a result of the introduction of Palomism? I mean, I hate to bring in modern examples, but I do so because I believe they're certainly pertinent. But I think Marcus and Mr. Patriarch, I think you can both appreciate this, how, of course, there has been an argument put towards Catholics for the same reason, which is, okay, well, from your perspective, Vatican II has introduced certain errors into the teaching. I'm not deciding one way or the other. I'm simply saying that that is a line of argumentation to bring people out of the Catholic Church and into Eastern Orthodoxy, as if Vatican II was some sort of, Palomism was some sort of great Vatican II within the Eastern Church of the 1350s. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, my understanding is that Palomism.
I'm not talking theologically. I'm simply talking in terms of the ways in which these things can perhaps be construed as leading to a more orthodox iteration. I don't mean orthodox in the sense of the Greek Orthodox Church, but there has been some form of deviation, and we need to return to a truer source effectively. I don't believe necessarily in this line of argumentation. I'm simply trying to conceive of an analogy.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. I think something like that. Yeah, it's the idea that Palomism was sort of a sorry, I'm distracted with kids here. Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
I mean, I think I'll put the same question perhaps to Marcus, because again, very very diligently listening and not commenting.
No, I sort of don't really have an opinion. Funnily enough, it's not really my wheelhouse. Sorry, I was hoping for Patriarch to say something, and I was going to dovetail onto what he had to say.
I'm too busy patriarching up in here.
No, indeed you are.
Man. My wife went on a grocery trip, and she just got back, so I've been sort of like half listening for longer than I anticipated.
And child minding, yeah.
Oh dear.
Well,
she's back now, but
get back in
only
the swing
recently.
of it now. Yeah.
Oh well. Again, my argument isn't a commentary on theology. My argument is a commentary on intentions. Effectively, we're trying to understand a mindset from which essentially someone like a Bessarion can effectively go along with this idea of the union of the churches, and then ultimately remain a Roman cardinal in the service of the Pope, rather than essentially entering into the Gennadius Scholaris school of Orthodox communion under the auspices of the Ottoman Sultan. And again, it's just an analogy. Don't read too much into it.
Just on that note, just sort of briefly, there's that old allegory that there were people, notables in Constantinople who used to sort of would murmur the saying that better a Turkish turban than a papal tiara. And I think in some respect there are those who vehemently oppose that as an idea, and I think Bessarion probably to some degree embodies that. And also there were probably elements of not just the Byzantine clergy, but also Orthodox clergy writ large, but of, as decayed as it was, of the Byzantine aristocracy and of the imperial order, who probably dissented with that sort of mentality. And if they had chosen to become uniates and had sought to favor the Western solution over the Eastern one, and we have to sort of take into consideration too, and it's hard for those of us in our current position to sort of really appreciate it, but how it would feel and what would sort of be on the mind and sit in the heart of those who are in real time experiencing the extinguishing of their nation and of their civilization, and the order to which not just they were accustomed to, but their ancestors for generations prior had been accustomed to, and in the face of, to use a Bismarckian term, to not relish oblivion, and in the face of conquest, in the face of the Ottomans, having to sort of essentially be forced to choose one pathway or another. Bessarion, like Platon, like Scholarios, were faced with that question. And, for a lot of people sort of in the modern day, we've never really had to reckon with that. And I just think it's an interesting perspective to take into, to ponder on, in this sense that those men in that time were faced with that very daunting and, I dare say, even fearsome prospect of, being a part of a nation and an empire that is decaying and will not exist in the future, and what goes downstream from that, and having to sort of essentially choose one path or another, I think is a very stark decision for any man to have to make in terms of staying true to his conscience, especially in a religious context.
And the other thing too is like I can understand the position of somebody at this Council of Florence, sort of looking at things as they stand, seeing the Mohammedan come surging in from the east, conquering everything, and thinking to themselves, our faith in this area is going to be extinct unless we make some some rapprochement with Rome, basically, and believing that to be better than extinction. I mean, I could I can understand that. Like, so it's not to some people's minds, like, I mean, quite reasonably, it's not as simple as like, as we gotta stick to our guns and everything will be okay. It's like, no, if we don't make this deal, like we're going away. Like, there will be no Christendom in this part of the world unless we get help, and that's better than nothing, right? So yeah, I mean, I am sympathetic. I get it, the pragmatic bit, and it's driven by a love of people, a love of place, and I'm sure a desire to preserve Christianity to some degree, even though there may be some machinations going on behind the scenes. Because, I mean, if you look at the Middle East today, or, not long after the conquest of Mehmed II of Constantinople, you have a situation where all these lands, which were previously Christianized peoples, are now, bending the knee to the Quran. And I could well imagine somebody in Constantinople at the time thinking that would be their fate as well if they didn't, come to some agreement with Rome and the powers in the West.
But again, I think Bessarion's arguments sort of go further than that. It's not just we need to defend our church or modify our church for the sake of national self-defense. Is that the church has already been modified in such a way as if to ease this process towards unification, as opposed to a pastiche, which I think something like Zosimus presents more so, which is that there is a pure, unadulterated faith, one that exists without the contrivances and the infiltrations of these Catholic traitors, effectively, who went over. But the Bessarion argument basically acts as a complete contrast to that, which is why I find it interesting. If Bessarion's honesty is to be impugned for his adherence to the Union, that of the archbishops who signed with him and of Patriarch Scholarius should be denied as well. His opponents are fond of quoting a phrase in the peroration of his Oratorio Dogmatica. For who does not know that the only refuge left to us in our dangers was the Latin race and union with them, our hope in their help to protect us and repel the enemy. They see in it a blatant affirmation of Bessarion's noble, ignoble patriotism. And again, that is essentially the best way to summarize the unnuanced view regarding the whole basis of the union of the churches. They should, however, continue reading some further lines on. But if we have discerned error in the doctrine of the Latins, or distortion in their faith, not even I would have counselled you to embrace union and agreement with them in that case. That for fear of bodily ills, you should prefer the values of the present world to the spiritual values, the freedom of the body to the betterment of the soul. But I myself would have undergone all of what that is worst, and I would have exposed you to it before. I would have urged you to union with them, and would have recommended such action. The Greeks, to preserve the truth that the Father is the prime source of all divinity, which the Latin doctrine does not deny, accounted that primacy as his property, and hence as excluding the co-spiration of the Holy Spirit by the Son. In his answer to Cabecelas Bessarion does little more than assert the Latin theory and support it by a few patristic questions. In a later work, he will dilate on this fundamental issue at greater length. So we go on from the basis essentially of we do not accept the premise that this is simply a alliance, this is a political alliance, because ultimately, I mean, these are not all medieval men, but we should think all Christians need to think in terms of the temporal and the spiritual realms. They need to think of the physical existences, and they need to think of the immortality of the soul. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if we concede all of these points regarding the temporary defense of the Greek civilization or whatever, the remnants of Eastern Rome, the Eastern Roman civilization, if it means we're all going to go to hell as a result of this. So one effectively cannot compromise the other. One needs to find a situation where we can achieve salvation on the physical plane, but also salvation in terms of our immortal souls, effectively. That has to be a consideration. We're not all basically talking about pragmatists in the way that we conceive of them as atheists who believe there is nothing beyond the existence of the physical world. And this goes on to the filioque and his own conception of it. And we've talked about the whole compromise, the Greek methodology of through the Son. And this is where Bessarion goes on to essentially explain how one can defend the filioque from an Orthodox position. On the later work, on the procession of the Holy Spirit, written for Alexius Lascaris Philanthropenos, was elaborated probably in 1445 when Bessarion had had time to reflect. So this is 6 years after the declaration of the Union, Rejoice the Heavens. He had not changed his position. The treatise begins with a short review of events that had culminated in the Union of Florence. The part that refers to discussions in the filioque. This edition had been utilized in the earlier part of this article. What treats of the filioque as doctrine is relevant here. Bessarion recalls that in Florence there had been acrimonious discussions between Eugenicus about the genuine question of St. Basil's Adversus Iconium. In Florence, of the 6 manuscripts used in the council, 5 had the text favored by the Latins. Eugenicus, on the other hand, had claimed that in Constantinople there were more than 1,000, like our codex. Again, because for so long Constantinople was essentially the reliquary of all sort of learning, in the same way that we see so much of Aristotelian thought being reintroduced back into Carolingian Europe as a result of the interactions with Muslim civilization that chose to preserve aspects of Greek thinking. There is also, as a result of that, you can almost say as a result of an intentional desire to forget that aspect, that Byzantium was the true home of the great sort of library of all of these codexes, not just in terms of the laws of the Romans, the civilization of ancient Greece, Platonism, Aristotelianism, but we're also talking about the whole legacy of all of the accounts of all of the councils of the church are held in Constantinople. And despite the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, the Greeks are still appealing to this authority, which they claim preeminence over, you can say, the archival significance over a place such as Rome, despite being the Civitas Dei, the city of God. Bessarion, on his return to the Byzantine capital, visited these libraries, nearly all of them monasteries, to settle on what was in fact the correct reading of this issue of the filioque. He found that manuscripts written after the schism had the Greek text, but that all the more ancient manuscripts written before the schism, so 1054, as numerous as the others, had Latin text. To his distress, he found also 2 manuscripts in the monastery of Christ the Saviour's Panatopatotes, one parchment updated, the other a paper dated to some 300 years earlier, in both of which the peculiarities of the Latin text had been effaced, but so imperfectly that they could still be discerned. No wonder that he exclaims against the hypocrisy of the Greeks, who accuse the Latins of corrupting codices. No wonder, one may add, that he himself was confirmed in his conviction that the Latins were right also to maintain their contention. So no one any more can show with justice or censure to let him effectively show that these books had proclaimed some form of truth. And again, there's this element of, again, linguistic nationalism which has been affected in all this. Of course, the fact that so many of the church fathers wrote in Latin as well as, writing in Greek. So we talk about the first Greek Bible, and we talk about the Latin Vulgata. But this notion effectively has become that since the Great Schism, everything which is worth recording has to be done so in Greek. And so we will forget the fact that, say, for example, Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire during the first, 200 to 300 years of its Christian existence, and all of these things. And so, of course, in terms of the great repository of knowledge and the codexes that we see in Constantinople, there are going to be ancient manuscripts written in Latin. But again, it's almost this intentional desire to forget that this essentially has existed, that, we have been Greek, we have always spoken in Greek. And in that sense, you can almost say there's an element of anti-Romanness. What does Roman mean effectively when you're trying to denounce the fact that, of course, these things would have been written in Latin of all things? Just interesting to consider. There is no need to retail the conclusions drawn by Bessarion from Boscaris from Basil's text. He does no more than repeat what Montanaro had said several times, urged in Florence, and as nothing new, except to give us proof that he was convinced by it. More interesting is his personal defense of dogma. It opens with a bird's eye view of the arguments. We put forward our saints, none of whom, except perhaps Damascene, but we never use him, says, from Father, the Father only. With our Father, the Latins agreed. They added, and from the Son, which does not contradict from the Father. This they proceeded to prove from saints and fathers, Greek as well as Latin, to which we had no other reply, except that they were falsified, and falsified by the Latins. They were quoted from Epiphanius, falsified. We said Basil's, interpolated, Latin doctors, corrupt. Having no text to disprove their case, we refused to talk. And this is going back to the arguments of Marcus of Ephesus, and his dogmatism regarding this, and his unwillingness to accept the validity of the union. And again, the fact that he essentially had to be censured by John VIII in order to achieve that position. A few said the Latin states are in error, but that would mean the end of the faith. What he effectively means by this is that the saints cannot be saints if they're not in heaven, and they cannot be in heaven if they have a heretical formulation of the faith. So even though their ways of expressing it effectively may be different from one another, the essence of what they're saying effectively has to be the same. And so, again, it's this appeal to the filioque as that which has fundamentally not existed in total contradiction can effectively form some form of bridge towards the Latins and the Greeks. I'm going to leave it there because, as you can probably tell, I'm I'm exceptionally tired, and this is getting into very deep theological questions, of which I promised this stream was not going to be about, simply because I don't think any of us are qualified to speak authoritatively about these matters when it goes beyond the question of how we can interpret this point historically. The important point is, which is what this article is really getting at, is that it's not necessarily that this is correct and true, and this is the proper way of having a theological reading which appeals both to the Orthodox and to the Catholic positions. Is the point that these positions are defensible, metaphysically defensible, based on appeals towards the examples of the saints and the church fathers, and that there is a theological logic which can sustain an argument for an Orthodox union with the Catholic Church. And like I said, you have other elements such as the argument of papal supremacy and the point of Eugenius's position being incredibly weak, which also lends this argument, the triumph of conciliarism. All of these points here are essentially to say that there is a very specific religious, political, cultural context which permits, you can say, the environment in which you can say ultimately the flawed Council of Florence union of the churches can be convoked, and you can't simply put this down to a cynical reading of bad theology, intentionally bad theology, for the sake of an appeal to pure cynical patriotism for the defense of Greece, which ultimately has no effect, because we see that with the effects of Varna, and we see that with the loss of Constantinople and with the death of Constantine XI. Yeah, I was going to read a segment from Bessarion, but I think it would just simply be sort of adding to the points that I've already made. So I guess all I can do now, we're nearly 3 hours in, is ask both of you for your sort of points in conclusion regarding the this novel period in history where there was technically a union of the churches, albeit as we've seen under so much strain.
Yes. First off, thanks for having me on. It's nice to be that when I return to my Apostolic Majesty streams, it's a good old nigh 3-hour affair, much in keeping with a lot of your other fine work. I love it. So on your point there about possible pathways back to union and sort of this interesting time in history, I would agree that there is a strain of thought which multiple pathways which someone arguing in good faith could definitely make a case for a union between West and East. And just as evidence of this, if you look at learned people on both sides of this issue of East and West, of Catholic and Orthodox, and the debates that they are still having, I believe, in good conscience, it's clear that both sides do make good points. Both sides have evidence, and you could have a situation where there are a great many of hierarchs of the church who lean one way or the other at a given time, and perhaps under certain pressures. But I don't think it is. I agree, AM, that is not necessarily a purely cynical ploy to sort of get Western support. That may be some certain people's motivations, but we can't read in the hearts of people today, let alone those who lived centuries ago. And the mere fact that there exist people operating in good faith who do have arguments to argue for unification on Catholic terms or on Orthodox terms, I think highlights this fact, really. So it's been really interesting going through this material with you, and hopefully it's not another year or two before I can have another discussion with you again.
Hopefully not. I think I found just before I asked Marcus to come in, I found this segment where Bessarion comments on his dedication to the validity of faith. Now more than ever do I put in that the first place, the true to faith. The more that age advances, the more do diseases of various sorts daily threaten me with death and make life unlivable. I know full well, brethren and fathers, I know, and I am in no way deceived. I have not much longer to live, and the time of my resolution is at hand. So this will be in 1072, so 2 decades after the fall of Constantinople, the loss of Trebizond and the loss of the Despotata Morea, but perhaps again with the glimmer of hope that was Sophia Palaiologos, even though that doesn't come to anything as we know. When there comes on men no small fear about what before caused them, but little fear. They see the time at hand when they will give an account of their lives, but me the closer creeps death, the more the purity of the faith consoles me, in the hope that my lack of works will be compensated for to my salvation by my belief in sound doctrine, for whose sake I put honour on one side to cleave wholly to this truth. But what I might have had with you, I held in little regard, and the things of the present world, may God bear me witness, I counted but as dung, and would have cast them all away had there been many times greater, and would have gone off to you, never turning back, if I had not been conscious to myself that I was choosing what was nobler and more conducive to salvation, if I had not been convinced that the Holy Roman Catholic Church was teaching and believe what leads to eternal life. So, Marcus, overall, your thoughts on the whole nature of this topic?
Well, I'll try and keep it as brief as possible, because obviously we have mentioned Varna 1444 here in the stream, but let's not forget there was actually another substantive, arguably even more feasible attempt to relieve Constantinople at the Battle of Nicopolis, which I believe, memory serves me correct, was
1395.
I was going to say 1393. Yeah, 1395. Which is a very close run thing. It was only due to this sort of folly of, the young king that sort of charged the Ottoman lines and managed to find himself hacked to pieces, and then the Crusader battle line crumbled in the face of that. But come the ever shrinking Byzantine court and the Byzantine world writ large post 1444, there was obviously degrees of desperation when one has to consider possibilities for survival in the face of, and let's face it, we're talking at this point centuries of erosion in the face of this force. It begins with Manzikert in 1071. There's obviously a stabilization period during the Komnenoi dynasty, and again degrees of reconquest. And had Alexios or even his son John II lived longer, would there have been a reabsorption of Anatolia? Who knows? But certainly with the events of 1204 and afterwards, the fall of the city in the Fourth Crusade and the complete disintegration of Byzantine holdings in Anatolia, and then with the crossing of the Turks into Europe via the Gallipoli Peninsula, their world had dramatically changed. And even if we even consider Baphius, for instance, and what was then the eventual complete loss of Anatolia, the loss of cities such as Nicaea, Nicopolis, Nicomedia, Bursa, etc., Philadelphia being the last Byzantine holding to have been taken at the very beginning of the 1400s. There must have been this feeling of utter desperation, hopelessness in the face of just unrelenting Turkey's success against the Byzantine forces and the Byzantine, this government being in a state of paralysis and just being wholly unable to not just contain the threat, but to offer any structured and ongoing resistance to it. And so, when we look at this ever contracting Byzantine world post 1444, and one could even say, post 1395, there's definitely this degree of desperation, and can they be faulted? Sorry, there's just some background noise here. But yeah, and at which point do ecclesiastical considerations supersede civilizational survival? And is it like a degree of pedanticness amongst those who rejected the Uniate, and were those who were in the opposing camp, indeed, were they justified given the events of 1204 and 1205 and the sack of the city in the Fourth Crusade? And was their cynicism of the Latins justified? Indeed, if we look at what has happened to Hellenic civilization after the fall of Constantinople, And the fate of the Greeks in Anatolia, which is something we have obviously touched on, AM, in the tail end of the Orthodoxy nationalism playlist of streams, were the or rather were the anti-uniate, people justified in the end? Hard to say. There's a lot of considerations at play, and all I'll say is that it's a very, very difficult, an almost impossible situation within which the Byzantines found themselves, and particularly the Byzantine clergy, the Byzantine aristocracy, and the leadership of at that point, the city, trying to find a way forward regarding their survival. I would not envy their position in the slightest. And
well, I hate to bring in modern arguments regarding the nature of colonialism, but if you look at the fostering of quote unquote Frankish nobles over Greek territory, the creation of the Latin Empire, the creation of the Ditoko and an Aragonese principality in Athens, and all of these things, and you have Catholic bishops and priests, trying to use not the uniate position, but the Catholic, the Latin rite, etc. You can understand the Greek position in terms of basically acting in terms of this conquered versus conqueror mentality that they develop towards the Francocratia or the Latitocratia. Like I said earlier with your reference to Gennadius Scholaris, the whole nature of Francocratia is emblematic of a pejorative hell. It's not just a religious distinction, it's a cultural distinction, as that of essentially resisting some form of foreign oppression. What I find about Bessarion, I do really want to apologize, because you can probably tell I'm sort of my mind is sort of putty at the moment in terms of really getting into Bessarion's questions regarding the filioque, simply because I don't think I'm currently at this precise second mentally equipped to be able to deal with them. But it's fascinating to me that Bessarion actually was a resident of the Empire of Trebizond. So he is perhaps, that can explain something in the sense that Trebizond was not directly affected to the same degree as, say, for example, central Greece was by the effects of the Francocratia, because Trebizond was so far removed. Obviously had interactions with the Genoese, but perhaps that distance, even though he went to Mistra and studied under Plethon, perhaps in the Empire of Trebizond there isn't that instance of such cultural antipathy that you perhaps can see in the rest of Greece. It's just a thought as to why someone like Bessarion would perhaps reach this position. But his position was typical, as we see by most of the priests who signed off in the Uniate. He wasn't the aberration. It turns out that Mark of Ephesius was the aberration. Just an interesting point. But thank you both, Marcus and Mr. Patriarch, for your very compelling points regarding this. So yes, just to get to the super chats, and we'll finish this conversation. A loopist for $2. I have no idea what that means. I'm not sure whether saying it will get me demonetized or not, so I won't say it. Valerian Kabatari, just as a super sticker, thank you very much. Sam Burke for $2, thank you. Love you, AM. Want to support a bit, best on YouTube. Well, thank you very much. Cyrus has gifted 5 memberships. I'm not sure how that works, but thank you very much. Seamus O'Blaine, you can set your VPN to a Euro country if abroad. I'm not sure how that's relevant, but thank you anyway.
I don't think we talked about VPNs at all, or internet connections.
PolySci 1980 for $5, thank you. Fantastic stream of an unappreciated topic. First time actually catching an AM stream when it was live. Well, thank you very much. Again, it's unappreciated simply because it's overshadowed by events. If it wouldn't be unappreciated if we had to talk about, say, for example, the success of the Crusade of Varna. As with all of these things, we're talking about theological disputations about the whole nature of the filioque, when in reality, as with so many things, events on the ground, superseded these questions, and ultimately the Ottomans under Mehmed II presented the world with a fait accompli. And we have this bizarre realization that from a certain Orthodox point of view, they can grow accustomed to the idea of the Turkish Muslim Sultan as being the successor of Constantine. But there we go. Lost Antique for $10. Thank you very much. If the Union had gone forward, but the Turks were successful, would Greek civilization have a greater trouble surviving as long as it did? Well, had the Union gone forward, as in had the Greeks accepted it, but the Turks conquered it anyway, well, I don't think it would have made that much of a difference, as much as people are pointing out. I mean, Russian civilization would have still rejected the Union because they had really no basis from which to accept it, because they weren't in the position of the Greeks. But if by some miracle the Catholic hierarchy, the Uniate hierarchy of Greece, have maintained discipline, and they were able to follow up and basically remain part of the nominal structure of the ecumenical councils going forward, is interesting to consider. But as we see with the alliance between Suleiman the Magnificent and King Francis of France, the Catholics were given their own protections and their own millet within the whole structure of the Ottoman Empire. So it's possible that what would have happened instead of having Gennadius Scalaris acting as an autonomous factor within the Ottoman Empire, is that there would have been a deeper relationship between the papacy and the Ottoman Empire, i.e., it would have been politic, as we see with the example of the King of France, for the Ottoman Sultan to appeal to Rome to basically act as, the nominal suzerain of all of the Greeks, the Uniate Greeks within the Ottoman Empire. I'm not sure exactly how that would have fared in terms of world history. As we saw, it was easier for the King of France to make that alliance because he was doing it primarily for secular and prestigious reasons, and I'm not sure how viable this idea of the Pope basically acting as the protector of Eastern Christians in concert with some sort of acceptance by the Ottoman Emperor. As we saw with what happened with the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, all of these things became far too complicated, and the Ottomans decided to slice the Gordian knot and simply go the way of Muslim Turkish nationalism ultimately. But it's possible. What I basically say happened on a smaller scale. What I basically said happened on a smaller scale within parts of the Ottoman Empire, especially when you're looking at the status, say, for example, of the Assyrian churches who went over and they joined and became Catholics. You talk about the Latin patriarchal sees in Antioch. I mean, the Catholics still maintained a Latin patriarchate up until the era of Vatican II. So the presence was never gone. The Catholic Uniate presence retained some form that lingered on. And of course, as we see today, it has existed through the Uniate churches as a result of the Council of the Union of Brest. That's a roundabout way to answer your question. It's not quite as interesting as it would seem, because to some extent that already existed within on a much smaller scale. It's simply a matter of the relational balance between these forces and how the Pope would have effectively been able to successfully mediate on behalf of the Uniate Greek Catholics. But I'm rambling now, so I'll leave it there. All right. Thank you very much. Do either of you have anything to say before we get out of here?
No. Aside from it's lovely to see Mr. Patriarch again. It's been quite some time, my friend, and thank you for the invite again. It's been a while since I dusted off the gloves, so it's good to be back. And just for those of us who have followed a lot of our streams and have watched a lot of our content, I've been highly preoccupied IRL, hence my quietness. But I do look forward to getting any opportunity to stream with you and to opine about all matters Byzantine and Roman, and dare say even Italic and Greek. So all these I very much appreciate the chance, and hopefully we have a few things on the horizon, because I've actually quite enjoyed this stream. So it's lovely to be back and good to see our friends all gathered once more. So cheers, guys.
And thank you very much.
Likewise, it's been a real pleasure to be on, and very illuminating, and looking forward to the next time we can do this.
And I understand if you have to remain muted for the rest, but just to say again, Mr. B, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope there isn't such a distance in time between your various appearances. Just to say one last super chat from Lost Antique again, just says thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you to my wonderful guests, and good night.